It all happened when the streets were pitch black. On a narrow, poorly lit street, one could hear sighs of pain. It turns out that these sounds were made by a black-haired young man who was lying on the ground in only one shirt and writhing in pain. And in front of him, a young, long-haired blonde girl was also lying unconscious on the ground, wearing a white top shirt and leather pants that completely covered her slender legs. Suddenly, a young man with black hair and snow-white teeth leaned over her body closer to her chest, but looking at her face, which he showed while smiling. Looking at the girl, he indicated, "Okay," by putting his index finger and thumb together. Then the young man carefully took the tip of the tie that was tied around the young lady's neck, with 2 fingers of his right hand, and brought it to his mouth, and began to lick it with his tongue, enjoying it immensely. But behind him, a man with a club in one hand was already approaching him. After walking a few more steps, the man shouted loudly to the guy who was sitting suspiciously on the ground. The latter, hearing the shout, turned his head back in fright, making giant eyes in surprise, because he thought that no one would catch him doing this. The man continued to move toward the culprit confidently, and pulled his other hand out of his pocket and made a fist. Seeing the young man's frightened face, he began to smile slyly. Then he rolled up his sleeves to his elbows and swung the club so that it was behind his right shoulder. While he was doing this, he continued to smile sinisterly and said, "The rapist's baton is a stun gun." The young man, who had been closely watching all the actions of the man, became even more frightened, and small drops of sweat began to appear on his face from excitement and lack of understanding of what would happen next. The next picture that appears before us is of a young man sitting at a wooden table and taking out a single cigarette from an almost full pack. He says that his name is Joah, and that in his previous life he fell to his death by accident. He rests his head on the palm of his right hand, which he places with his elbow on the surface in front of him. With squinted eyes and raised eyebrows, he looked in front of him as if into the distance or into emptiness. Slowly raising the cigarette to his mouth, he continued to say that after an accident he found himself in this body, although he used to be number 1 in the criminal world, and now he is in a group of detectives investigating serious crimes in the city of Q. Then the man decided to go outside to light the cigarette he was holding between his teeth and smoke it in peace, because the department was in complete chaos. So the chief said that tonight, everyone would have to work overtime to investigate the case of the baton stun gun rapist. However, one of the officers decided to ask if he could take a vacation at that very moment. This question made the already angry boss very angry, and he shouted at him how dare he ask for a vacation. Once on the street in front of the front door to the police station, the man stopped and reasoned that only the deaf had not heard about this case, so the police could not stay away. While he was thinking about this, he put a lighted cigarette to his lips, from which the smoke rose up like a thin thread and took a drag. He began to think about what to do next, maybe to return to the previous lesson. It was not clear yet, and in an instant, the man got very angry and went into the bar, sat down at the counter, and slammed his fist on it, because it turned out that the body he was in had never smoked before and did not know how to do it. So, in addition, he shouted, "Kill me." However, he still continued to hold the cigarette between his teeth. After all this, a transparent screen with a white border appeared in front of him and the text, "The system has been successfully launched. Now the trigram will be selected." This action was very surprising because it happened too suddenly. He froze a little with his mouth open in surprise, and continued to look closely at the screen where something started to run, as some incomprehensible signs appeared, quickly changing each other. After a few minutes, the man realized that this was the mythical system. Once launched, the past cannot be returned. A memory flashed before his eyes of how just a few months ago he was having fun walking freely with his friends on the streets of the city drinking beer. He composed himself, pressed the cigar between his lips, and quietly said to himself what good this system was. Continuing to sit at the bar on a high stool with his feet up, he tried to take another drag to calm his nerves. Because he didn't have a single friend in this damn place, would he have to spend the rest of his life here? Suddenly, the man's gaze fell on something to his right that caught his attention. Not far from him, on a nearby chair, he noticed slender, long legs wearing flesh-colored tights and a black leather miniskirt. Then he looked up a little higher and saw huge breasts with a short white shirt top and a thin black tie tied around her neck. The man decided to fully examine the girl. She turned out to be a slender blonde with long, thick hair that reached her lower back. She was drinking wine the same color as her manicure, red. And noticing that someone was looking at her so closely, she turned her gaze in his direction. While he was doing this, a small copy of him appeared in his head and said happily, "Oh my God, this girl is so stunning." A few seconds later, he composed himself and said quietly, "My lady." Hearing these words, the girl turned around to get a good look at who was addressing her, and she saw a tall, black-haired guy wearing a long black cardigan. He smiled sweetly and said, "You." Without listening, the girl started twirling a strand of hair around her index finger and said briefly, 3,000 a night. This knocked the guy out of his rut, because he was not expecting to hear this, and had to sit back in his chair to avoid falling from the amount he heard. The next thing he did was to ask with a smile if he could get a discount. When he didn't get an answer, he sent her as far away as possible, because he didn't even have 1,000, and then added that her price was just a robbery. A few minutes later, a blonde guy dressed in a white shirt approached the girl. He hugged her around the waist, calling her beautiful, and suggested that they go upstairs because there was a luxury suite there. The girl leaned her head against his chest and said that she would gladly go with him. This action surprised Joah, and he supported his head with his hand and looked sadly after them. Suddenly he noticed that someone was watching him. He turned his gaze from the couple to the side and saw that at the end of the counter was a guy who was thinking about something and was wearing a dark blue hooded sweatshirt and light jeans with white sneakers underneath. The guy kept staring at Joah. The detective didn't like it, so he gave him the middle finger and asked him what he was looking at. After that, he returned to his chair, and the guy put a hood over his head and calmly began to move towards the exit. Joah watched him and said to him that he was obviously a very strange guy. And then the man remembered that at a meeting in a group about investigating serious crimes, it was said that there had been a rape with electric batons in the city. All the victims were beautiful young women with low social status. Most of the attacks took place near bars. The third victim had her face torn open by the killer, thus obtaining a blood sample of the perpetrator, which is now being studied in detail. The detective noticed that this young man had a wound on his face, and he assumed it could be the maniac. But he realized that catching bad people is the job of the police, and he began to think about whether he needed to be fair at all. So he continued to sit there with his hands folded in front of him. In the alleyway where the back door of the bar was located, a black shadow of a man appeared, reflected in a large puddle, which also reflected the full pink moon that was in the sky that night. The man was dressed in a long black coat with the collar standing up. He stepped into the water with his white sneakers and began to curse, because now one of his feet would be wet. This man was Joah, who put his hands in his pockets and thought about the fact that he was an expert in this field. As he moved slowly down the alley, in front of his feet, he first noticed a blonde head. It surprised him so he started to get a little nervous. From what he saw, sweat began to appear on his face in small droplets, because in the middle of the alley, a blonde man dressed in a white shirt was lying in his path. After taking a good look, Joah's face seemed familiar, and he recalled that this was the man who had taken his girlfriend from under his nose. The detective noticed that the posture was stretched and seemed not natural at all. So he started looking in front of him, examining everything in detail, and at the very end of the street, where the lighting was rather poor, he saw the silhouette of a person sitting over another and doing something quietly. Because of this, Joah assumed that this was exactly the maniac the city's police were looking for, and taking a baton, began to move right towards him. When he got close enough, he saw that a guy in a blue sweatshirt was leaning over the body of a long-haired girl from the bar, quietly picking at something. The detective laughed and said loudly, "So it's you," which scared the young man who hadn't expected to be caught. Joah stood calmly, holding the bat in one hand, and hiding it in his pants pocket in the other. He was waiting for what would happen next. The guy carefully and slowly turned his head in his direction, and the detective quickly put his wooden weapon to his cheek and asked, "Is the rapist a baton or a stun gun?" When he did not receive an answer, he hit the young man so hard that he lost consciousness and fell to the ground curled up. The detective called the police to the crime scene, and they gathered everything and took everyone to the police station or to the morgue. They took blood samples from the suspect to compare it with the blood from the previous crime scene. Joah's colleagues were standing at the entrance to the police station when they were told that the results of the examination had come back, and the match was 100%. This man is the same maniac. People started talking among themselves about what had happened to Joah Yu because he had just had a fight with Commander Liu, although it was not like him. It was as if he had been replaced. The second said why he decided to solve crimes in the first place, because he had never done it before. And the third one added saying that everyone thought the man was acting strange, like he was hiding something like a gangster. At this time, Joah was already throwing up a wad of money, saying that he did not know that they also give a bonus for a caught criminal. Then he left the workplace, happy to hold the money he had earned with both hands, and thought that it was not so bad for a detective. Suddenly, a transparent screen appeared in front of his face again, saying that the unexpected meeting was over, with a completion rate of 75%. The next tape began with congratulations on receiving the invisible bug, and it was said that this device can only be used once. This again made the man worry, because he had not yet fully understood the system. A minute later, the next message appeared, saying that after using the object, it was possible to carry out secret listening, and that no devices would be detected for 48 hours. To use this, you need to accept the consent. Without hesitation, Joah pushed the button and agreed. After that, he began to wonder if the system had arranged this meeting with the rapist. He decided to go to the dorm room where he was temporarily staying. Taking up the pen, I reasoned that 75% of it must be related to the mission. Entering the room, he assumed that if he had not followed that rapist in the bar, the degree of completion would probably be lower. Tiredly, he took off his cloak and said quietly that no matter how many random encounters the system arranges, it is up to him to catch them. Lying down on the bed, he was happy to finally get some rest, so he put his hands behind his head and thought about whether he would be able to solve such cases in the future. And if he did, it would be time for bonuses, which he could spend on bars where he would treat girls and have fun with them. He dreamed about it so much that his mouth drooled. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Joah was sitting in a 24-hour KFC, tired and red-eyed from not getting enough sleep, eating his favorite burger. One of the customers approached him and suggested that he must have insomnia. He sat down at the table next to him. The detective replied that he did not expect his roommate to snore louder than a thunderstorm. After finishing his meal, he headed out angry because it was too noisy and smelled bad. As I walked out the door, I asked myself how I could live here. Once outside, he pulled out a cigarette, put it to his mouth, and lit it. Then he added that he was going to go in search of a new house right away to rent it and live in peace. And before he could think, Joah was overwhelmed with emotions from fatigue and began to shout loudly in the middle of the street to get them out. After that, a screen appeared where the man read that the adventure system had started, and the infection will be a trigram. The detective pulled himself together. He stood near the KFC building and began to calmly smoke a cigarette and read the information that appeared. 57th hexagram, Qigong's breath. The conditions were such that you need to go with the flow, live in peace and tranquility, revolve around nature and be successful. And the man wondered if this system was based on the theory of the 8 trigrams. Then Joah began to imagine it all, and assumed that going with the flow was not so bad after all. While he was smiling and daydreaming, a black-haired girl in a red blouse was moving in his direction, holding his right hand and bowing her head. In an instant, she fell to the ground and asked for help. One sleeve of her shirt was torn and there was blood on her face. The detective turned his gaze in the direction of the call for help to see who needed it. However, the lady had already landed face first on the asphalt with her legs up. Joah quickly started moving towards her. When he got closer, he saw something he was not too ready to see. That's why he squinted his eyes, and his gaze was full of misunderstanding of what had happened. The lady was lying unconscious and bleeding. The detective drew attention to her arm, which had an elastic bandage wrapped around it, and blood was oozing through it. The department stated that on the morning of April 22nd, the woman collapsed in front of KFC on Z Street. She was found by Officer Ju, who was passing by. He helped stop the bleeding and then called the police and an ambulance. The victim is currently in the hospital, and it has been confirmed that she is not in danger. It is believed that this woman is connected to the hand snatcher case from a year ago. The police have not yet released a final statement on that investigation, which is still ongoing. Joah stood silently and looked at the painting hanging on the wall. He came to a certain conclusion that this three-dimensional reconstruction was not good enough. After all, the author failed to show the heroism of his act. Then he turned his head back with a wide smile on his face and asked her what she thought about it. And he was addressing the same girl he had saved a few days ago. She was lying in a hospital room, tired, scared, and with a bandaged arm. However, she grabbed a pillow with the other hand, and she threw it in the direction of the detective, shouting loudly that they hadn't even been able to get on the trail of the criminal. All they do is ask a bunch of unnecessary questions. In the end, she added that the whole police force was so useless. The man thought about her words for a moment. Smiling, he noticed that the second pen of the force can do this many times. It made the girl so angry. She forced him out of the ward, shouting at him to get out of here. Once in the corridor, the man met his assistant, who was frightened by the situation that had just happened. So as they walked down the hall, she asked Joah not to be so rude, because the woman had already lost her arm, so she should not be further irritated. Taking the packet of paper, he began to study the information written there in detail. Then he said that he was just trying to show her that she should be more positive, because at least she still had her left arm. What he said again surprised the assistant so much that she made very big eyes. The file stated that this woman was the third victim, and her name was Luo Main. It went on to say that the perpetrator hid in her car behind her, and while she was driving in the direction she wanted, he was sitting there waiting for the right opportunity to knock her out by suddenly putting a wet handkerchief on her face. The next thing the attacker did was stop the car on Z Street and cut off her arm. The next morning, the victim woke up in her car. Then she got out and ran to the nearest building to ask for help. As he continued walking down a long white corridor, Joah said that a woman met him. The assistant said that this was a case of a serial hand snatcher, and it was the third time he had appeared. Their team had been investigating the case for a year and hadn't been able to find a single clue. Pausing for a moment, she said that the detective had already pissed off Commander Liu, so if he couldn't solve the case, he would get into big trouble. And the man plunged into memories where he asked in the commander's office that all he needed to do was find this hand thief. It was very easy as pissing. After that, the commander said that if Joah could solve the case, he would pay for the TV he had broken. The assistant interrupted his thoughts by reminding him that if the second squad solved the case faster, it would also negatively affect him. Joah said irritably that he had nothing to fear because nothing was impossible. Standing in the toilet doing his little business in the urinal, he remembered that today, this system appeared again. So he said quietly to himself, with the help of it he was not only able to catch the rapist, baton, stun gun, but also to rent a new apartment. And as long as he has this system, there will be no detective better than him. He said the last phrase too confidently with a mysterious look. As soon as he came out of the restroom, he asked what was known about the other victims. The girl started reading from the files. The first was Gao Tian, born on April 22nd, exactly 1 year ago. She came to this city for a concert. The attacker knocked her out and cut off her right arm in an underpass. The second victim, Yuan Lily, had a more complicated situation. She woke up at home with her arm already cut off. And the strangest thing about this story is this. Joah was already looking forward to finishing the sentence. The assistant continued with the strange fact that the burglar-proof door remained completely intact. This means that the criminal had a key. The detective thought for a few minutes, saying a long, Then he started to read the case again. The woman walking ahead of him said that somehow. The attacker managed to avoid all the cameras. They couldn't even find a single fingerprint or hair. He was like a ghost. When she finished speaking, I heard a short, "Listen." I turned around in surprise to look at Joah. He asked her with a confused expression if he would not be able to solve the case if she could lend him some money. The girl laughed at this question and just said senior in a cute way. Leaving the hospital, the assistant saw a camel with its owner, who offered to take group photos for 5 yuan. The girl was so eager to do it, she grabbed the detective's hand and said, "Let's do it too." The man replied, "What?" because he didn't notice anything, as he was still studying the case files. Suddenly, someone on the street started shouting, "Thief!" Then they continued, "Hold him." This attracted the assistant's attention, but not the detective's, because he was so engrossed in the story that he did not take his eyes off the sheets. The girl decided to distract him by saying that they needed to catch the thief. Joah replied that she was joking or something, because they belonged to the major crimes unit. So why would they waste their time on something as trivial as a common thief? He said all this without taking his eyes off the stories on the sheets. Then he looked up for a few seconds and said, "You wanted to take a picture with the camel, so let's go before he walks away." As he was saying this, he saw a black-haired girl running towards him in the middle of the street, shouting "Thief!" and asking him to help her. When she was right in front of the detective, she stopped and looked him in the eye and said that her purse had been stolen, and she stood up to catch her breath, because she had been running after him for a long time. And instantly a picture from the past came to mind, and this girl turned out to be too familiar to Joah. He remembered her name and said it in Yao Jia's ear, to which she replied, "Brother." He used to have a romantic relationship with this cute girl. After that, he looked at the young lady with incomprehension, wondering if this could be possible. That he was not the only one who was reborn. This scared him and made him angry at the same time. So he quickly turned around and pushed his assistant so hard that she almost fell, but the sheets were scattered all over the street. Joah ran up to the camel, jumped on it, and grabbed the string so that he could control it. The assistant asked him what he was going to do. In response, she heard that the man was going to get rid of the seizure and began to look intently at where the criminal ran. The man gave the camel a command and ran down the street very fast. To slow down the man who was chasing him, the criminal threw various fruits and vegetables from the shelves, which fell to the ground and began to roll in different directions. However, this did not affect the speed, and Joah continued to follow the young man. Various products continued to spin around the street, and the vendors tried to collect them back by crawling on their knees on the ground. After running a few meters, the thief decided to look back to see if he was still being chased. A giant camel with a man on its back was running right behind him. So he decides to slow down a bit and pulls out his pocket knife. Having caught up with the man, he decides to strike. But he doesn't have time, because Joah has already grabbed him by the hood of his sweatshirt and pressed him tightly against the camel, asking if he was serious about stabbing him. This made the attacker very angry, but he looked up and asked, "Who the fuck are you on a camel?" He didn't hear anything in response, so he was hit on the head with a board. A hole formed in the board and it got stuck on the guy's neck. He even dropped the knife from his hands. Tears also began to flow because his head hurt so much from the blow. So the guy started to hold on to it and asked again, "Dude, who are you anyway?" This time he got a verbal answer. Joah, holding on to the rope, said that he was a prince on a horse, and then he threw the young man to the ground and pinned him down with his foot so that he could not escape. When the detective returned to the hospital, people asked him since when did the police hire such crazy people. This did not bother the man, so he just listened calmly. All this was said by 2 security guards who continued to say that because of his prank, the whole alley turned into ruins. Now all the vendors come here to complain. Joah and the victim stood silently and watched the monologue of one angry guard. Suddenly, the second one started to demonstrate, as he shouted a detective's ID card, which stated that Joah was an employee of the Serious Crime Department. Or, to be more precise, from the R Division. At this time, the policeman was sitting quietly on a bench and cleaning his nose with his right pinky finger. Then he turned his gaze to the side, because the victim approached him. She smiled sweetly and said that she was a nurse at the main hospital, so if he had any problems, he could go to her. As the girl continued to sit next to him on the bench, the detective began to think, this is definitely not Yao Jia from his past life. Maybe the name just matches, and they look exactly the same. Moreover, he didn't have time to think about it because an argument broke out in the corridor behind him, with the father ordering the young man to leave and leave his daughter alone. After everyone was done shouting at the top of their lungs, the detective pulled out his phone and held it out to the girl, saying that if she didn't mind, he would like to keep in touch with her. This request surprised the lady, and she paused for a few minutes in thought. During this awkward pause, Joah reasoned that it didn't matter who she was. However, he knew for sure that he did not want to lose her again. Suddenly, a screen appeared in front of his eyes with white text with blue backlighting, saying that the collision was over. The detective went outside and sat down on the first step in front of the entrance. He continued to read that the degree of completion was 72%, and it said that an invisible listening device had been obtained. Behind him, an assistant stood waiting for the man with a large folder of papers in her hands, but he did not pay attention to her and continued to think about whether all appointments are set by the system by chance. Taking a sip of energy drink, he continued his thoughts on the fact that when he thought about the investigation, he met Yao Jia. Therefore, one must learn and understand how the trigram system script works before trying to use it. Otherwise, he will constantly fall into unnecessary scenarios. When he finished his drink to the bottom, he clutched the bottle in his hands and said, "For now, we'll have to rely on our personal strength." The first thing he decides to do is to get as much information as possible related to the case. So he suddenly stood up and said to his assistant, "Let's go." And the sudden rise scared the girl a little, and she asked where to go. In response, she heard a short, "To the toilet." He entered the Department of Serious Crimes. He was confronted with a number of facts. The first one was that if the perpetrator left no evidence. Second, it turns out that everything was planned from the very beginning. And third, the attacker had definitely been following Luo Ming for some time. This was said by a woman with short black hair, large breasts, and blue eyes. She folded her arms under her chest and asked if they looked like idlers, and without giving an answer, she added that if the police department doesn't interrogate, they investigate, and they take certain messieurs to solve the cases. The detective stood there with his hands in his pants pockets and pretended to listen very carefully and take everything she said seriously. The woman pointed at him with her index finger and said, "We don't fool around like you." By chance, he noticed something interesting behind the brunette's back. Turned out to be a detailed analysis of the case, which was shown in the form of a diagram on a large white board. Without answering anything, he just began to look at it with enthusiasm, because it had a lot of relevant information. This enthusiasm was watched by the woman who had been lecturing him a few minutes earlier, as if he were a little boy. She began to recall how her boss had told her that she was doing a good job with all the work she was given. So from now on, the people on the team are at her disposal. He added that they were very talented, because they recently solved the case of the Bait-on-Taser rapist, and she can always consult with their boss. While Joah continued to carefully study the information about the crimes, the woman wondered how it was that she had never heard of such a reckless guy. After all, he had appeared out of nowhere to take her case. The detective thought that it was not surprising that he was constantly caught in the past, given how cautious they were. And he added that he could bet that there were many photos of him on the same board. However, he remembered the one that had been teaching him a few minutes ago and said, "But what about her?" And at that time, the woman said that she had heard that he had argued with the team that he was going to solve the case on his own. This time, when he looked at her, he said quietly to himself, "Good." Then the lady became so confident that she even put her hands to her sides and asked if he had reached a dead end and would ask for help from Team B. A second later, she added, Does he want her help personally? Joah thought about this suggestion. He stood there for a few minutes just looking into her eyes, hands in his pants pockets. He was trying to figure out what he should do in this case, whether to accept her help or to work on his own. And suddenly, he walked over to her at a brisk pace. He leaned her against the board so that one hand was slightly above her face. This scared the lady, but at the same time aroused her curiosity. The detective smiled slyly. He thanked her and asked her to understand him correctly. After all, he came here for something unrelated to the case. And taking his hand away, he added that if she was so afraid that he would solve the case first and take all the glory, she should relax a little. Colleagues who saw this scene and did not fully understand what was happening angrily asked what he said. Joah happily began to move down the corridor, saying that he was sad to see all the work going to waste. These words enraged the already angry workers even more, and one of them had to hold the other and ask him to calm down, because he was already rushing to fight and shouting that this bastard was looking for death. After walking a few more steps, the man pulled an earpiece out of his pocket and put it in his ear, through which he could hear the conversation. But the criminal had managed to escape all the cameras on his way through the alley, or he was familiar with the place, maybe even lived there. Joah's memory flashed back to the situation that had happened a few minutes earlier, when he had pinned the woman against the wall. At that moment, he was able to quickly place an invisible bug right on their whiteboard, and now he can hear everything they are talking about, and no one would be able to see it except the detective. Then he heard the following information through the earpiece. The tests showed that Luo Ming was used for inhalation, 2 types of anesthesia, and an internal injection. One of the anesthetics is often used on large animals. This made me think about the word tranquilizer. The conversation continued with the fact that the victim's arm was chopped off with a sharp weapon, like an axe, in one blow. The perpetrator dragged victim number 1 through the tunnel, so you can imagine that he was a strong man. The forensic medical expert said that the attacker did not touch the strong radius bone, so we should not rule out the possibility that the attacker could be a woman. The forensic department also found traces of an adhesive substance in Luo Ming's car. It seems that this is how the criminal got rid of the prints. The detective began to imagine what the person they were looking for might look like, and for some reason he was wearing a red long coat, and the man wondered why the criminal was so careful to hide his figure. What exactly is he trying to hide, or could it be? Suddenly, in his fantasy, Joah's face was touched by long white hair, and these facts gave him an idea that it could really be a woman. Then the earpiece began to talk again about how all 3 victims were not related to each other. Could the perpetrator have acted completely by accident? Or was he mentally unbalanced? The detective began to think about why the attacker took only his hand. Then, standing at the blackboard, he loudly said that the culprit's goal was revenge. Everyone in the room turned to the man. They asked how he realized this. Joah smilingly turned to face his colleagues and sarcastically said that it was just intuition. Then he imagined a blonde woman who has a similar board at home with the names of those she wants to deal with written on it, and she gradually crosses out those who have already received their punishment with a red marker. And in jars she keeps preserved severed hands. Each one has a sticker with the victim's name on it. Turning again to face all the evidence, he continued that the criminal takes the severed hand as a trophy, and he suggested that they are hidden in a place that only he knows about. And every time he sees them, his hatred subsides. Joah pulled out a cigar and started to drag on it, thinking about why all the victims did not have the right hand.
He put his to his chest and began to examine it, not yet understanding why it was so valuable.
However, he put the cigarette back in his mouth and smilingly said that he thought the system would help him with this. As soon as he said this, a transparent screen appeared, showing that the system was successfully launched. Suddenly, the detective noticed slender legs wearing yellow sneakers and peeking out from under a high curb. While talking on the phone, he was fascinated by this, and he heard a woman's voice in the receiver, saying that she was right in front of the entrance to his station. He replied that he understood, and then he added that he could see her right now. She was looking at a fluffy white cat kneeling in the middle of the street. The girl turned around, smiling, still holding the phone in her hand. She had beautiful, big blue eyes and a short haircut that was complemented by bangs. Carefully taking a Pepsi out of her backpack, the man asked her to tell him what she was doing here. After the question, he unscrewed the bottle and began to drink in small sips, and the thought flashed through his mind that it wasn't even 7 in the morning and he hadn't slept all night. The girl grabbed Joah's t-shirt and clarified that she and he were accomplices. What he heard surprised the man, and he froze for a moment, remembering that he had caught her trying to steal money earlier. At the time, the girl said she was wrong and asked him not to tell her father about it. Joah, smiling, then said that he would keep her secret, but they would share the stolen money equally. The lady asked him if he was blackmailing her just because he wanted to rent a house from her father. The man said that she shouldn't say such offensive things, because now they were accomplices. The next thing I remembered was when I chose the system that led to her on a transparent screen in front of the police station. I did not think it would happen like that, and the phrase "go with the flow" led him to a new life. He put one hand in his pocket and used the other to take another sip of water, and told the girl to just tell him what she needed. The girl folded her hands in front of her as if in prayer, and asked Joah to come to her parent-teacher conference. He was quite surprised by this offer because he was prepared to hear the worst, but not what he heard, so he spat out all the water he had just put in his mouth in surprise. And turning to face her, he clarified that she must be joking. At that moment, the girl jumped on the man's back and whispered in his ear that she had already deleted her father's message from her phone and sent him a copy. Trying to free himself from the lady's tight embrace, he said that as soon as her father found out, he would kick him out, and where would he sleep then? The lady hugged him even tighter and smilingly said that if he had no place to sleep, he could stay with her. She added, "So help me, Daddy, please." The detective listened carefully to the request, looking her straight in the eye. After that, he agreed to help, but warned her not to try to call him Daddy again. So when he came to the parent-teacher conference at secondary school number 2, which took place in the music room, he sat with a serious face propped up by his right hand. He recalled that his girlfriend had told him that they were in the same boat. If his father came to the meeting and found out about her absences and identity theft, he would also get it. Emphasizing that he was a police officer would have made the situation even worse. Because of the fatigue and everything that was happening, the man had a headache and said, "What kind of girl is this? Why did he even contact her?" While someone was performing on stage, the detective waited for it to be over. And then he noticed the hands that were playing the piano, and noticed that they were very beautiful. The music that started to play calmed and relaxed the man a little bit, so he sat there mesmerized, and wondered what could have happened to make someone take them away. One of those who sat and listened said that it is not every day that one sees such a wonderful piano playing. The woman who spoke was embarrassed by what she heard, and said that she hadn't played for God knows how long. However, 20 years ago, she had participated in a competition at this school to get into the music school. And if she had made the effort, her life would have been completely different. After all, this high school used to be called the Chapel of Music of their city, which raised many geniuses. Listening to this dialogue, the word music made the detective think, and he thought that if he was right, the second victim was a music professor at the college and had very good piano skills. Taking out his phone, he remembered that on the day the first victim lost her arm, she had come to a concert. And maybe... Before he could finish, he heard the voice of his assistant in the phone, who said that she was working at the police station and asked if he wanted to check something. In response, he heard a request to find out if all the victims were somehow connected to the piano. After giving the order, he continued to sit in the chair in the music room, assuming that if 2 of the victims were somehow connected to this musical instrument, then perhaps the third was also somehow involved. Suddenly, the phone rang throughout the hall, drawing evil glances at Joah. So in order not to test people's patience any further, he quickly began to take it out of his pocket to pick up the phone. Putting the smartphone to his ear, he quietly said hello, and then he got up from his seat and decided to leave the room altogether. One of the parents present asked whose father was so ill-mannered. This did not stop the detective, so he said, Tell me, into the phone. The assistant told him that the concert Gao Tian was attending was a piano tour. She asked how he had guessed that. In response, she happily heard, "Jackpot, damn it." While Joah was still moving toward the exit, another woman said, "Is that the father? So vulgar." And then a banter started among all those present, because they began to assume that he must have a poorly educated child. Another said he saw him come here with Jiang Xiaoqing. The third mom said that this girl was in the top 3 in this year's exams. The detective kept talking on the phone and asked what about Luo Ming. After hearing the information, the parents began to admire him because they thought he was raising his child so well. Another parent said that he looked very handsome. After a moment of silence, the assistant said that all 3 girls were studying piano in the 10th grade. They just took the test at different times. Joah asked to study their school history in detail and find the names of all their classmates. After hanging up the phone, I reasoned that if this is revenge, the criminal must know them all. After all, if she knows they can play the piano, then she can play it too. The assistant had already arrived at the hospital and was showing the last victim the other 2, asking if she knew them. She replied that she did not. When Joah received this information, he turned his head towards the musical instrument on the stage. He wondered if all 3 victims didn't know each other, where they could have crossed paths with the perpetrator. And then I remembered that the woman who played very beautifully today said that 20 years ago, she had participated in a competition at this school to get into the music academy. And I realized that everything was connected to the competition. It turns out that the criminal must play amazingly. She participated in the competition with the victims and lost. After that, she began to hate them, and she decided to take revenge at any cost, no matter what it took. The curator had just come on stage and said that he had decided to hold this parent-teacher conference too. But he didn't have time to finish, because Joah walked out the door and said, "Blah, blah, blah." This made the man very angry, and he shouted at him how dare he interrupt him and why the phone was so loud. Once in the hallway, the assistant called again and said that she had found something, namely that all 3 victims had participated in the 10th city piano competition among high school students and had become finalists. This information made the man very happy, and he said, "Bingo." A second later, he asked where the competition was held. The woman replied that it was 18 years ago, in the music hall of high school number 2. She added that she needed a little more time to find the list of participants. While the woman was speaking, the detective turned around, opened the door to the room, and said loudly, "Right here." The curator, who was seriously angry, was already on his way, and told Joah to listen to him, because he was too, but he didn't have time to finish because the detective put his arm around his shoulders like a hug, scaring the teacher a little, and then asked if he had a list of participants in the 10th piano competition. The man didn't quite understand what was being asked of him, so he repeated the question and said, "What?" In his mind's eye, Joah had already seen the woman and said to her that she should definitely be on the list. After that, the men went to the archive, where the teacher started looking for the right record, and while he was doing it, asked the detective to forget what happened a few minutes ago. Not finding it as quickly as he wanted, the curator said that it was a long time ago. It makes no sense for the school to keep records of competitions from 18 years ago, so they could have been thrown away long ago. Joah sat on the windowsill with one of his feet on it. He told them not to worry, because he was in no hurry, so they could keep looking. Suddenly, his phone started ringing loudly again. At this time, the teachers, who were close to each other, began to cry because they did not know how long they would have to search for the document. Taking her smartphone out of her pocket, the assistant happily said that she had found the list he needed. A few hours later, the detective and the assistant arrived at the home of the 10th place contestant, Jiao Shan. As it turned out, she was pregnant, and it was already the last trimester, as her belly was big. The woman said it was quite a big competition, because the main schools always come to it, and the judges were very famous teachers from music universities. The top 3 were chosen by the famous schools, and the 4th to 6th places were chosen by ordinary schools. Everyone below the 6th place emphasizing like her, listened to the words of the most ordinary teachers. After listening carefully, the assistant thanked the woman for her cooperation, and she replied, "You're welcome." Joah began to recall the words of the woman who had spoken at the meeting. She had said that if she had made an effort, her life would have been completely different. He then suggested that perhaps because of this competition, the culprit had to live a life she did not want. The assistant sadly folded the sheet with the list and said to herself that she had once again made a mistake in misidentifying the main suspect because among the 10, she should be the most suspicious. The detective said that the woman's stomach was too big, so she would not have been able to pull off the last crime and cut off the victim's hand. The woman said that if the culprit was not on this list, they would have to go through all the participants again. Joah smilingly put his hands behind his head and added that this was a very good idea, and he decided to leave the difficult task to her. The girl was very upset by this and started to cry, saying that he was just waiting for the time to laugh at her. The policeman came very close to her and asked her in her ear with a big smile if she minded. After all, he really wanted to catch the culprit. The girl calmly looked at him and emphasized that he had changed a lot. The man happily said that in his past life he was a gangster and only recently remembered who he was, so he hadn't gotten used to the life of a police officer yet. The assistant grabbed him tightly by the cheeks and told him that she was referring to his eye bags, which had become even bigger. After calming down a bit, she added that he hadn't slept much in the last few days. She suggested that he rest. Maybe it would help clear his mind, and he would realize what to do next. She assured him that they were definitely moving in the right direction. Suddenly, a transparent screen appeared, saying that the lucky collision was over. The degree of completion was 88%, and it was reported that a universal key had been received that would open any lock and a 6-digit password. The man began to think about the fact that the degree of completion was so high. He wondered if the parent-teacher conference and the lead that led to the case being solved could be connected to the system. His thoughts were all jumbled from fatigue, so he decided to go home and try to activate the system again. Putting his hands in his pants pockets, he said that he accepted her offer and suggested that she also go to rest, and finally added that they would meet tomorrow at the station. The assistant waved goodbye and said a clear and short, "Okay." As the detective approached home, he began to think that if the attacker was going to do the same thing as last year and wait 3 days for her next victim, then she should show up tomorrow, and then he would definitely catch her. After saying these words, he began to smile. At 5 in the morning, the man was woken up by a loud knock on his door. He could not understand what was happening, and then he heard a woman's voice shouting for him to open the door, because she knew he was inside, because she could hear him coughing in the middle of the night. And then he realized that it was Zhang Xiaoqing. He saw the situation in his mind's eye as he hugged her frightened curator and asked her to find the list. Then he showed him his ID card, saying that he was an officer investigating the case and needed him to cooperate with him a little. After that, he realized that he was going to get in trouble for what he had done, because he had completely forgotten about the parent-teacher conference, and she is here now because of this, and is clearly not in a good mood. So he decided to quickly get out of bed. While he was doing so, he heard a question outside the door asking if he was going to open the door. The detective did not answer, but silently began to crawl under the bed. The girl, not receiving an answer, said that she would open the door herself if he did not want to. These words alerted him a bit, and he froze for a minute. Suddenly the door opened, and the brunette found herself in a room with no one else. Only her shadow fell on the floor. Nevertheless, the lady decided to walk around the room and examine everything carefully. So she started moving on her tiptoes, so as not to make too much noise. When she got to the bed, she quickly lifted the sheet and looked under it, sure that he was hiding there. But there was no one there. Opening the curtains on the window, she began to wonder where he had gone. So she went to the door. She opened it abruptly so that Joah would not have time to go anywhere, and it would take him by surprise. However, he was not there either. This made the girl angry, and she slammed the door loudly, shouting, "Bastard, just wait." Turned out that all this time the detective had been hiding on the balcony of the neighbors. After a few minutes passed and the young lady closed the door, he decided to return to his room. Jumping between the balconies, he said that he had almost forgotten that this girl was his landlady, and she had a key to his apartment. He grabbed the handle of the door on the balcony and found it closed. This made him angry, and he asked why she had closed the door, and he started thinking about how to get inside. After a few minutes of thinking, he came up with an idea to try to do it through the next door. When the landlord showed Joah the apartment, he told him that 4 beautiful ladies lived next door to him. The one in the apartment with a set of underwear hanging on a string was a girl who worked at night, so he decided to go inside the building through her door. Because it was only 5 in the morning, and she shouldn't be at home. Therefore, the detective managed to get into her room very easily through the door from the balcony. The room was quite spacious, and all the things were tastefully arranged. Joah was satisfied that no one was really at home. So he began to move freely around the room, looking at everything. However, the girl was in the apartment. At that time, she was quietly changing after work, but she heard someone's footsteps. She came out of the bathroom to see who was walking around, and suddenly came face to face with a man wearing a black t-shirt and black hair. The detective was very frightened by this appearance and said, "Here we are." The lady was very scared and started screaming loudly. Joah was not confused and covered her mouth with his hand, but he began to think that this time he would not be able to prove his innocence, so he decided to carefully remove his hand. The girl asked if he was an officer. This surprised the man. Holding his hand and smiling, she continued to ask him if he didn't remember her. A second later, she added that he had saved her from a rapist a few weeks ago. A picture of a long-haired blonde woman lying unconscious on the ground really came to mind. Hiding his hands in his pants pockets, he began to tell her happily that he lived next door, and that his balcony door happened to be closed. Because of this, he thought there was no one in the apartment, so he decided to try to leave through it. The lady listened attentively with her hands behind her back. Then she took a cigarette and put it to her mouth, saying that who would have thought she would meet him here. Turning her back on him, she continued, "What about this? Usually she is still at work at this hour." She took a lighter and lit a cigarette. Taking a drag, she added that what had happened to her had left its mark on her heart. Coming very close to Joah, she looked him straight in the eye and told him that she had decided to take a little rest. She laughed and said that there was something that was on her mind. Then she came close to the detective's ear and asked him quietly how he knew that the rapist would attack her. Was it police intuition or what? The man replied that there was no other girl there who was prettier than her. But a second later, he added that maybe the rapist was of the same opinion as him. The lady laughed out loud and then pushed the detective on the bed, saying that it turns out that Officer Joah is quite romantic. Having said that, she jumped on top of the man and smilingly said that her neighbor would be back in the afternoon. Such a chance is very rare. Leaning very close to his face, she added, "Why don't they—" But before she could finish, a notification came to her phone, ruining the intimacy. Joah instinctively turned his head toward the device. He saw a photo of the girl playing the piano on its main screen. Leaning over it, the detective decided to ask about the photo. The girl put a strand of hair behind her ear and said that she was still at school. The man approached her a little closer, holding the phone in his left hand, and asked if she knew how to play the instrument in the photo. The blonde woman took her smartphone back, threw it on the bed, and asked mysteriously, "Why can't you tell by my face?" She leaned a little closer to her lips and said that her mother had forced her to learn the piano as soon as she learned to speak. And finally, she added that she had participated in the competition of high school number 2. Suddenly, Joah flipped her onto her back and got on top of her and decided to find out which competition she was in. Hugging him by the neck, the girl smilingly said that he was in the 10th, and then asked why he was so interested. In his mind, the man thought that this was the one in which the criminal was also participating. So he leaned over so that he was looking directly into her eyes and asked her if she knew the names Gao Tian, Yuan Lili, or Luo Main, because they took 4th, 5th, and 6th place. The blonde woman put her finger to his lips to silence him. She said it was wrong because they were finalists. And she didn't play that well because she couldn't even get into the top 20. Then she asked the officer to tell her why he was asking about all this. Then she hugged him tightly with both hands around his neck. Smiling, Joah replied with a question to the question whether she had heard anything about the hand thief. The girl calmly said that it was probably the case that everyone was talking about non-stop lately. The detective added that the victims involved in this case were participants in the same competition. The blonde woman was silent for a few seconds, and then asked him not to say that she was too. Joah leaned her head against his face and said that at that moment, all the victims were finalists. Then he asked her if she remembered anything. It doesn't matter who or what, the main thing is to tell them, because that's how they can solve the case. She snuggled closer and said that if she remembered correctly, something strange did happen. A detective was driving a car down a city street, ignoring signs and traffic lights. The detective was smoking a cigarette and listening attentively to the assistant who was sitting in the front seat in surprise, and told him that Lee Dan was very famous all over the country before the competition. She said that she was only 12 years old when she participated. From the very beginning, this girl was a very promising participant, but she suddenly gave up the day before the final. She asked if someone could have bribed her to do so and prevented her from taking first place. This question made Joah think. Then he said that he had heard that Lee Dan's family was quite poor. And putting his hand on the assistant's head, he continued to tell her that they had to sell their ancestral home to pay for piano lessons. It was her only chance. So it didn't matter how much she could have been offered. She would never accept it. Then he turned his gaze to the side window and added with a serious expression, "If you can make it to the top 3, your life will change completely." It seems something happened during the competition. The assistant asked what they should do now. Because there was no record of her family in the police station, it was as if they had evaporated. Joah didn't answer, but he did ask if Sinhua was being protected. After all, it could be the next victim. The lady replied that she had immediately sent a team there after his suggestion. And then she asked if he really thought the criminal would make her move today. The detective smilingly said that they were going to see a missing persons professional. If anyone knows where Lee Dan might be hiding, it's him. The assistant asked if he meant Zhang Yizin Feng. After all, his help could cost a very tidy sum. The man asked why. The girl replied that he was the kind of person who only works when there is a benefit. Many people in their department hate him and don't want to deal with him. They nicknamed him the Sly Elm because of his character. To the information he received, Joah replied, "Interesting." Then he stepped on the gas pedal and said, "Then we definitely need to go and see this Briar as soon as possible." As we entered the billiard room, the policeman called out, "Brother Joah." The man stood there with a cue and asked the detective what he was doing here. The detective smiled sarcastically. The people who were also playing billiards began to mockingly repeat what the man had said. The assistant said, angrily, that he knew everything and was asking anyway. Joah began to recall how he had called Zhang and asked for help in finding someone. He replied that he was a little busy at the moment, so if he wanted to talk, he could come to him. So he said out loud that he was waiting for good news. Punching through one of the layers, he smilingly asked what was the rush. The guests began to say that he was stupid, that he came here as if to his home. The girl was already boiling with anger, so she said, "You." Zhang put his hand on the detective's back and led him inside the room and told him not to be shy, because they don't get to play together that often. The policeman turned to him and asked how long they would play. The man laughed and said that Brother Joah was an expert. Then he added that the two of them were getting enough. So how about 50? The detective picked up the cue and seriously asked how many moves there would be. Zhang replied that he could make as many moves as he wanted. Suddenly, the stick broke into 2 parts because it was hit hard on the table. Chu saw this and said 50 with a smile. Then he grabbed the cue of the man he came to see and broke it by knocking it against his leg and said, 100. This action surprised Zhang very much, and he got really angry. He grabbed the detective by the shirt and shouted at the bastard that he wanted to die. The policeman was not confused and threw the first punch, and it was so strong that he just flew back like a feather, and Joan didn't know if he realized how bad his breath was. The next blow came from the leg to the groin. After that, the man landed against the wall with his head bowed, and the detective continued to ask if his mother hadn't taught him to brush his teeth before bed. Zhang writhed in pain. "You bastard, you hit me between the legs!" Then he fell to the ground and, pointing his finger, ordered his friends to beat the man and not let him leave alive. The people immediately began to follow the order, so they grabbed their sticks and one of them said that the detective would die and began to move directly towards the attacker. Joan stood next to the assistant and watched this action. He calmly asked her to step aside and not interfere. Rubbing his beard and smiling sarcastically, he said, "It just so happened." He hadn't warmed up for a long time, but a little anger would come in handy. So he knocked out one of the attackers with just one punch to the face. The second one was hit in the beard from below. The third one he just slapped hard. He fell to the ground with his leg up. The policeman rubbed his hands together and started laughing out loud. However, he turned his head with a serious and angry face. He saw Zhang start to smile and asked him nicely to talk. Joah grabbed his neck with his hand as if to hug him and said, "Come on, I'll pay for dinner for you one day, but not now." To which he replied that he didn't need to, because he was always ready to help his brother Zhao. And all three of them began to move towards the exit. They managed to find the house where Li Dan was living at the time. A policeman and his assistant had already rushed there, saying that it must be the right place. Although it was disconcerting that the alley looked quite poor and cluttered, and very empty, I remembered how Zhang managed to find them. He explained that everyone gets sick sooner or later, so it doesn't matter how they change their name or surname, the medical records have everything. He continued that 15 years ago, her father had to visit the hospital several times because of a heart attack, and last year her mother was hospitalized because of a tumor. Therefore, they will not be able to leave the city. And on the sheet he gave the girl's address, although it may not be valid. Joah noticed that this place is about 100 meters from the street where the third victim was attacked. She managed to avoid being caught on camera in the alley, so she is very familiar with this place. Maybe she even lives here. I started to imagine a girl in a red cloak taking her arm away, with a serious face, not a drop of pity or sympathy on it. She approaches the front door, and then the question arises whether she is just carrying a severed limb home. So not to stand there and guess for a long time, the man raised his hand to the door and knocked. A tiny crack appeared in the door, just a few centimeters. A woman's figure began to peek through it. Not a young woman anymore, probably her mother. The assistant said hello and showed her ID and asked if Li Dan lived here. The lady invited them into the house and began to serve them tea. The detective walked around the room and calmly asked if her daughter had played the piano in the past. In response, he heard that the piano was a taboo in their family. After all, they had never talked about it since her father's death. The assistant decided to clarify by asking what had happened. The mother, looking at her reflection on the tray, said that Li had always been a very famous child. In the past, she had won first place in many competitions. 10 years ago, in a competition at high school number 2, she came in third in the preliminary round. When she showed her teacher the song she wanted to play, he asked her if she was sure about her choice, because she thought there was not much difference between her and the other participants. That's why she decided to hang her hat in the final, where they were allowed to choose the piece themselves. The sponsors organized the practice the day before the final, and at the very last moment, just playing on stage. When everyone left, Li stayed to practice, and when she plunged into the game, she felt a terrible pain in her arm, and when my father and I got on stage, we saw that all the piano keys were stained with her blood. The doctor said that the middle finger on her right hand was cut off by a sharp object. Part of the finger could still be reattached, but if the parents could not find it in time, it would be useless. For a child who had nothing more precious than a piano, losing a finger meant the same as a death sentence, so her father quickly came to the middle school classroom. He saw that the blood had already been washed off the piano, and part of Li Dan's finger was gone. This upset the man very much, and he just leaned on this ominous musical instrument and began to sob from powerlessness. Recalling all this, the mother began to cry, but continued to say that the sponsors did not want this situation to affect the other participants in any way, so they decided to hide all the news about it until the very end of the competition. And then it was too late, because the police were unable to find any clues. All they knew was that Lee's finger had been cut off with a sharp blade. Someone had placed it between the black and white keys. It was a place that was rarely used, but Dan pressed this key because of the piece she had chosen. And it was the one she had to press hard. The person who did it was very jealous of the girl and worried that she would lose. Even after physiotherapy, when her arm recovered, she couldn't stop trembling when she touched the piano. The mother had already sat down on a chair to calm down a bit, and continued to say that her daughter was wounded, not only physically, but also emotionally. After a short period of time, the father had a heart attack due to a heart condition, after which he was hospitalized many times and eventually died. Joah listened very carefully to this story, because even a small trinket will be useful. So in his mind's eye, all the information he had received matched. The only thing left to do was to find the evidence, and he noticed that there was a mysterious door with a chain hanging on it, closed with a lock. The policeman asked the woman whose room it was. She replied that it was her daughter's. Joah started walking towards her and asked her a few more questions. Where was the girl now? Did she go to work? The mother replied that yes. She had gone with a troupe to perform in the village and warned him that she would be gone for a few days. The man began to analyze. It turns out she was working in a theater company. The film that the attacker used in victim number 3's car could also be used in the theater. The policeman took out a small dip from his keychain and said that he would not hide the fact that her daughter was involved in their case. After all, someone is hunting her. At this time, he began to twist what he needed out of the dip. This message surprised the mother and the assistant. Then he began to carefully open the lock, saying that it might be the same person who had placed the blade. Therefore, he needed to check her room for evidence. The woman jumped to her feet and told him that her daughter didn't like people coming into her room, and if she found out, she would get very angry. The policeman, who was already holding the open lock in his hand, told her not to worry. They were only doing it to keep her safe. And then he added that he would do everything as if no one was in the room. That's why they are professionals. Carefully opening the door, he began to take small steps to enter. And right in front of his face, he saw a human skull. What he saw scared the assistant, who was also trying to enter the room with her husband. So she started screaming loudly. After that, she threw herself into the arms of her colleague to calm down a bit and control her emotions. When they turned on the light, it turned out to be a mannequin. Smiling, Joah told the girl who was still hugging him that everything was fine. He added that she was just imagining things. She asked if it was true, just to be sure. The man offered to see for herself if she didn't believe him. Then the assistant cautiously turned her head and calmed down a bit. The mother followed them into the room and asked what had frightened the lady. However, she received no answer. The detective started looking at the shelves and noticed that there were books about anesthetics and plants. So he asked the woman if her daughter had studied medicine before. The mother said no, but she had worked as an assistant in a veterinary clinic for some time. The man recalled that he had heard through an earpiece earlier that the test had shown that 2 types of anesthetics had been used on Luo Ming, an inhalation and an internal injection. One of the anesthetics is often used on large animals. I noticed that all the victims were injected with the same medicine used on animals before they lost their arms. The next thing the man asked was why there was no table. Then he lifted the mattress to see what was under it. The woman began to worry again and asked what the officer was looking for. The assistant took her hands to calm her down and told her that it was nothing specific. They just wanted to have a look around. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the loud word, "Found it," which the man said as he lowered the sheet. He started laughing out loud. When he calmed down, he turned to the mother and said that her daughter did have things that were very important for their investigation. He asked her to wait in the living room while he and his colleague documented the evidence. As they left the room, the mother asked how this would affect her daughter. The man told her not to worry because he would tell the police to keep an eye on her. After closing the door, the assistant asked why he kept lying. The girl's eyes grew huge and she covered her mouth with both hands to prevent herself from screaming again. So under the bed they found the murder scheme: a rope, jars with severed limbs, and much more. The assistant did not expect to see all this here, so she had a lot of questions and few answers in her head. A closer look revealed that each jar had a sticker with the victim's name on it. Afterwards, the girl said that the detective was a genius. She asked how he had guessed that she was hiding everything in her room. The man said with a satisfied smile that the girl locked her room, which was strange in itself. He emphasized that Lee Dan's right arm was injured then, just like all the victims now. Her mother had surgery last May, just after 2 cases of amputations. Therefore, 9 months later, when her mother's feelings returned to normal, she committed the 3rd crime. Because of this, all the missing evidence is right in front of them. Looking at the photos, Joah said that she had prepared all this to cut off their hands. And then he started to smile, adding that he now saw a clear picture of those strange crimes. So he began to imagine that on that day, the 24th, Lee Dan was present at the same concert as the first victim. After it was over, she followed her. After that, she knocked her out and dragged her into the distribution room. After cutting off her arm, she immediately left the crime scene. After putting Gao Tian's limb in a container with formalin, she hid it, and only after 2 months she returned to take the arm, so she had to sit in the ventilation until the morning. After that, she used the same pipe to get to the gym and mingled with the crowd, and managed to get out of the building. The same day, she went to the home of her second victim, Yuan Lily. She waited on the roof until the night of the 25th. She used a ladder to climb onto the roof of the victim's house. Carefully and quietly, she moved from step to step. Then she had to go down to the balcony door on a rope. The girl had previously made a duplicate of Yuan Lily's keys. She had also installed a device there, so she knew for sure that the woman would be home alone that night. Once inside the room, she spent several minutes looking at the woman who was sleeping soundly and unsuspectingly. After she cut off her arm, she hid underground for 7 days. The policeman noticed that the girl had even prepared a toilet pot and left no trace of evidence. The assistant listened to all this and said, so much, how much she hated her victims. Only one person had harmed her at the time, but she decided to take revenge on all of them, leaving each of them without an arm. The man squinted his eyes as he began to think quickly. He saw the image of the water pistol. He still didn't understand what it was for, and the picture next to it showed a cemetery with a grave that was also unclear why it had been dug up. The man's thoughts were interrupted by a colleague who asked him to look at another photo. It showed a girl, Xiao Jiaying, an entrepreneur engaged in international trade. That's why she moved to Austria. The policeman remembered that this girl took 3rd place in that contest. Therefore, she is the next victim. Next to this photo was a ticket that said that she was flying to Q at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Joah quickly opened his phone to see what time it was, and saw that it was 4 hours and 15 minutes. This made him very upset and angry. He quickly ran out of the room and shouted that he had to find Lee Dan. He ordered his assistant to film all this evidence and go to the police station for help. The girl quickly pulled out her smartphone and began to take pictures of everything. She said to herself that everything was true, because she had checked it out. It turned out that Xiao Jiaying was indeed the same Xiao Lulu who had won 3rd place in that competition. While her husband was running down the alley, his assistant shouted to him that she had been accepted to the National Conservatory of Folk Music, where she started her business in the field of musical equipment and became a well-known entrepreneur. So she decided to change her name. Approaching the car door, she asked the driver if she was not in Australia. The man replied that the grave belonged to the girl's father. He grabbed the wheel and added that Lee Dan had dug the hole there on purpose. And then he pressed the gas pedal with all his might. Then he told her to send a fake document to Xiao Lulu, telling her that her father's grave had collapsed for no apparent reason, to lure the girl here and cut off her hand. He drove away so fast that the assistant simply did not have time to get into the car. Finally, he shouted that there was too little time left, because the plane had already landed an hour ago, so they had to hurry. Further events will take place at the cemetery. There, A sad Xiao Lulu in black round glasses stood over her father's grave, and behind her was the figure of an intruder holding a giant axe. The policeman was driving so fast again that he didn't even stop at the red light. However, he could hear the voice of his assistant in the car, saying that he could not follow Li Dan's phone. Then the man offered to find Xiao Lulu. The girl asked for a few minutes to do so. While he was waiting for an answer, he said quietly to himself, "Li, where are you going to attack her?" And then he assumed that the girl had only come to do this problem. Where else could she go but to the cemetery? So he stepped on the gas and noticed that there were no security cameras there. It was the perfect place to commit the next crime. Crossing the road at that time, the boy turned to his grandmother and said that his uncle had run a red light. The woman replied that he was a very bad man. Let the police catch him. At the cemetery, Xiao Lulu was already lying unconscious, and the criminal swung an axe over her body. However, she heard someone's voice loudly ordering her not to move, and the girl turned her head back to see who it was. When she saw the unknown man, she began to run away from him along the path, and he was catching up with her, shouting for her to stop. They ran through the cemetery for a long time. Joah got tired and began to shake him off a bit by saying that she was running too fast, and these words made her stop. The man pulled out his handcuffs and asked her why she stood up, and twisting them around his index finger, he began to approach her respectfully. However, the girl was not confused and turned around and shot him with a water pistol, though not with water, but with a small arrow-shaped syringe containing some unknown substance. But he remembered a picture he had seen at her house of this weapon. Suddenly, everything began to blur in his eyes, and with his last strength, he said that it was a sleeping pill and watched the criminal run away for a few more seconds. After that, he fell to the ground with his face in the sand. However, after a while, he began to hear voices. The assistant asked someone if he was okay. An unknown voice asked her to calm down and explained that it was just a quick painkiller. The colleague continued that with such a small dose, he should wake up in a few minutes. And the man began to open his eyes a little to see the one whose voice he really liked. In front of him, he saw a beautiful young girl whose name was Wang Fei, a specialist doctor. His pupil was still small. However, he remembered saying, "Damn." After that, he quickly began to rise to his feet, which frightened the audience, and the doctor, holding the man's hand, asked him not to make sudden movements, because the effect of the sleeping pills had not yet passed. These words were confirmed, because the detective felt very sick again. Everything around him seemed to be out of focus, and he fainted, falling right on top of the brunette standing next to him. He knocked her right to the ground. The assistant was watching and could not understand what to do next. The doctor was just smiling sweetly. During the fall, the man came to a little bit of consciousness, but his head continued to hurt very much. So for some time he knelt in front of the beautiful woman. However, he heard a request from a colleague to get up, so he decided to stand up. After that, he saw the hand of a beautiful doctor in front of him, as if asking him to help her get up as well. Without hesitation, the man gently took her fragile hand, but he pulled so hard that the girl found herself in his arms. However, she was not confused by the situation, and heard that a detective, a bully, had appeared in Team A. Stepping back from him, she added that she did not expect it to be Joah, and then she started to smile. The confused detective, in turn, apologized for the situation that had just happened. Then he turned to his assistant and asked where Xiao Lulu was and what happened to her hand. In response, I heard that the woman was fine. Turning his gaze to the side, the policeman saw the man acting as the commander of Team A, Liu Zhanghu. He then asked why Joah hadn't reported all the evidence in time, because if the killer fled the city, they would be in trouble. While he was saying this, his colleague had already given the order to inform the workers at the checkpoints around the city. Then he asked if he only cared about their dispute. The assistant replied angrily that they had just found the evidence. Moreover, they were not sure of their assumptions and asked what would happen if they provided incorrect information. The doctor, smiling sweetly, also said that if Zhao had not arrived at the scene first, Xiao Lulu might have lost a limb. In addition, he was shot with a dart containing anesthetic, so it was very dangerous. A moment of silence was interrupted by the detective's loud laughter. Then he approached the commander and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that they had agreed that he should catch the killers. But a second later he added that he would keep the monitor on him. He turned around and calmly walked down the path. However, the assistant said that the exit was in the opposite direction. Despite all the words, he approached one of the graves and swung his leg. It hit the tile on top of it, and cracks began to spread in different directions. A second later, it fell into the middle, forming a round hole. Everyone who was at the cemetery at the time ran to it, frightened, and began to look inside. There they saw Joah, who threw his arm around the criminal's shoulder as if hugging her, and asked to take a close-up photo of him. They were both taken out of the pit and the girl was handcuffed. The assistant standing next to the detective was very impressed by everything that had happened. Then she turned to Joah and asked him how he knew that Lee Dan was hiding in the grave, and the man began to speak slowly. He couldn't say it before he fainted. He had attached an invisible bug to the criminal. He continued that the last time Lee Dan was cut off, she hid on the roof of a house for 7 days. Obviously, she would not go far this time. The girl put her hands in the air and asked how he knew which grave to look in, as if he knew exactly where she was. This question stumped the detective a bit, and he was a little confused. Suddenly, the assistant raised her index finger up and said that she didn't think he had lost consciousness at all, but he saw with his own eyes how she climbed into the grave. For a moment, Joah was silent, realizing that she would soon come up with the right answer. However, he folded his arms as if in prayer and praised her for her good deduction. He added that he would not hide anything from her, and at that moment, a transparent screen appeared on which it was written that the meeting was over, and he gets 5 invisible lie detectors, 10 minutes long. While the policeman was watching in the background, the assistant was still enthusiastically saying that he had even put on a show for Captain Liu. The man didn't really believe her words, thinking that the degree of completion was quite high. But tossing the invisible lie detector in his hand, he said that this toy would come in handy again. Running his fingers over his leg, Joah sat on a chair looking at a new trigram that said that the lucky meeting system was activated. 51st hexagram. Thunder follows the lightning, and only together they split everything in half, making the 5 elements rage. It all sounds like a hint of a meeting with a killer. Tom was already sitting in the meeting room with Lee Dan. The girl bent her head over the table and asked, "Yes, who was it?" The detective did not understand what she meant. Then the criminal suddenly put her right hand on the table with half of her middle finger missing, and she asked loudly who did it, who then put the blade on the piano. Joah calmly remarked that since she didn't know who did it, she decided to cut off everyone's hand. The girl kept getting angry and shouting that they had ruined her life. Everyone who got to the final is equally responsible. Then she added, suggesting that one of them had already confessed to what she had done. This was the only way the police could get on her trail. After such an enchanting speech, the detective asked her if she really thought that they had no other way to find her besides the victims. If so, he added that she was very arrogant. Lee calmed down and listened to the fact that none of the 3 admitted to having hurt her. Everything turned out to be much simpler. It turned out that they all participated in the same contest, and that's when he found her house. Hearing this, the girl was angry again and shouted, "It's impossible!" Then she got up from the chair and leaned on the table and said that even if he could find out about her, he would not be able to find where she lived. Joah replied that he had read it in her mother's hospitalization records. The girl said that even if he did, nowhere in the records did it say in which grave she would be buried. The detective reasoned that he couldn't tell her about the invisible tracking device on her ass, so he simply said that her anesthesia had worn off earlier than it should have. The girl sat down on the chair in a daze, saying that it was impossible. She sat there for several minutes, and then she looked up and said that her father had pinned all his hopes on her. However, she turned out to be worthless. Her father was dead, and her mother had cancer. She added that there was nothing left in her life. Tears rolled down her face as she spoke. Joah listened intently, sitting silently and looking directly at her. Then he got up and headed for the door. As he was leaving, he asked her if she had thought about her mother before starting her revenge, how she would survive if she was not at home, who would take care of her. These words really hurt the attacker's already wounded soul. That's why tears flowed from her eyes. The man continued by saying that the human heart cannot lose its balance, and hatred cannot cross the line. After leaving the cell, he was torn by rage himself. After all, he had not yet found the person who had harmed Lee Dan. He went to the office where everyone usually gathers for discussions. A man with 2 giant bodyguards was already waiting for him. The man pointed his finger directly at the detective and said, "He's here." Then he added, shouting that it was definitely him. The bald guard began to flex his fists. Behind him, a man shouted that it was the man they were looking for, and ordered to catch him. Joah did not understand what was happening. He just stood there and watched. And then he struck a blow so hard that the man who was approaching him flew to the side. Then he started rubbing his arm, and I heard the commander shouting at him to stop, because they were representatives of the merchants from UC Lane whose goods he had smashed on the camel, so they were here to get compensation. The assistant added that they had also formed a committee and had come to complain about him. The detective tried to remember which traders. The ones in front of him now looked more like small extortionists, whom he had seen a lot in his life. So he went up to the main man, grabbed him by the ear and showed him the sheet, and said that he would teach him something. He also asked why the amount of compensation was so large, since he had not inflicted any bodily harm on them. Since he came, he should at least formulate his demands correctly. They didn't even invite reporters. I asked them why they had come to organize a circus, and smiling ominously, he added that they could be imprisoned for lying. Suddenly, someone spoke to the detective, distracting him. As it turned out, it was a very beautiful girl who smiled sweetly and asked him to accept 100,000 yuan from her, which a security guard was holding behind her in a black case. When she got a little closer, she put her hand on the detective's shoulder and said she was very grateful to him and offered to have dinner together tonight. The commander watching the scene shouted at him not to take the money. Joah, smiling carefully so as not to offend the lady who was cleaning his hand, said that as for dinner, unfortunately he could not, because they have their own rules in the police. And as for the money, he asked if she could write a statement about a voluntary donation, because otherwise he might get in trouble. The girl calmly and briefly answered, of course. After writing what she had promised, she gave the detective her business card. All the police officers in the room were watching them, and as she was approaching the exit, she waved goodbye and said that if he needed her help, he could call her any time. Joah smiled back and said, of course. After the woman left the station and the door closed behind her, the detective grabbed the vendor by the scruff of the neck and held up a wad of money to his face, telling him to take it and take it to the alley where the misunderstanding had occurred. And after letting him go, he stood calmly in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and watched. As the representatives headed for the exit, they told him not to worry because they would do everything as he said, and they promised that all the traders would get their share. This picture did not cause any emotions on the detective's face. As soon as the representatives left, Joah turned to his colleagues and happily said that tonight he was treating everyone. This news made everyone very happy, and the room started to get loud as everyone started discussing where they would go and what they would eat. And at that time, the policeman came to the board with the crime scheme, and he was looking at a photo. It showed him and the criminal, and next to it was a list of participants in the 10th competition. Tearing it off, he began to carefully reread all the names and look at the scores. Then he sat at the table with this sheet with a cup of coffee and pointed to one of the names and said that these were the results of that year's competition, and the scores of the person he was talking to were very high. And he suggested that only the 4 of them could benefit from Lee Dan's leaving the competition. Then he added that at least one of the 3 victims was guilty of this. Lee Dan would have been caught long ago, and it would not have been her turn. It turned out that he was talking to Xiao, who paid him a lot of money. Everything he heard made the girl angry, and she asked what he meant. And then she shouted and asked if he thought she could have harmed Lee Dan, because she was the one who wanted to cut off her hand. So it turns out that she is the victim here. After listening to everything, the detective calmly asked if she had ruined Lee Dan's life. The lady didn't answer, just made giant eyes. The policeman decided to continue that when he mentioned the name of the criminal, the girl had no doubts, because she knew the name of the person who wanted to attack her beforehand, and she also knew what happened before the competition. After these words, Xiao said that she may have participated in that contest, but it doesn't prove anything. Squinting his eyes, the man said that he was checking her personal data. In order for her to participate in the contest, her father had forged her documents. He went on to say that she even tried out for the 9th contest, but failed to make it to the final, and the 10th one was her last hope. Then he added that out of the 4 finalists, she was the only one with a motive. The girl shook her head sadly and said, "Where is the evidence? He is a detective here. After all, without evidence, it's just empty words." Joah said that she already knew that if it wasn't for the blade, her life would be the same as hers, if not better. However, now the suspect has lost her father, and her mother has cancer, and she is burning with hatred in her soul, and she can't take it much longer. The woman pressed her lips together and asked him to stop. Then, putting her hand on her heart, she asked him if he had any idea how she had lived all these years, because she realized that he had left her without a future. In the end, she added that she had been living with the inevitable shadow of her past for so many years. The man listened attentively with his mouth slightly open. Then he gently handed Xiao a napkin to wipe away her tears. It took her a few minutes to calm down and say that she was really involved in this case. She began to tell me that 18 years ago, the day before the competition, she rehearsed until 3 in the afternoon on the orders of the committee and then went to her room. In the evening, her father came and said that he had forgotten something in the lobby and had to return. Xiao offered to go with him. Her father replied that it was not necessary and ordered her to stay in her room and not go out. The girl emphasized that her father rarely spoke to her rudely. That is why she could not sleep that day. It was already 11 o'clock in the evening when her father returned. He hugged her and asked her to do her best tomorrow because she had to prove herself. Jamal remembered that when the day of the award ceremony came. She was very nervous and decided to run to the bathroom. That's when she saw Li Dan's mother arguing loudly with one of the committee members, saying, "They can't do this to her daughter just because of one piece of blade." She asked how her daughter would continue to live because she has a gift for playing the piano. She said she only then learned that Li had been eliminated from the competition. Joah said she started to think about it carefully and realized that the time when it happened was exactly the same as when her father left. During the ceremonies, the girl stood with her head down, sad, and her father, sitting in the front row, happily asked her to smile because he was going to take a picture with his phone. However, the lady could not force a smile because at that time she hoped with all her heart that her father had nothing to do with it. So she continued to say that on the day they were packing their bags to return home, she found a whole box of special blades in his bag. They had a big fight about it, and he confessed. And on his knees he begged her not to tell anyone about it. Wiping away her tears, Xiao said that her parents divorced when she was a child, and her father was the only one who cared about her, so he was ready to do anything for her. Sometimes he had to work 3 jobs and didn't even have time to sleep. Sobbing heavily, the girl added that she wanted him to go to prison, but karma caught up with him. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died a short time later. Although it wasn't her fault, she felt guilty for what he had done to Li Dan. A second later, she emphasized that after that competition, she never touched the piano again. Every time she saw it, she thought of Li and her severed finger. Wiping away her tears, she asked the officer not to worry, because she had decided to find the best lawyers to defend the suspect. She folded her hands on the table and added that she would also take care of her mother. She bowed her head and said that she knew that money could not solve all problems, and she does not expect her to forgive her. Xiao just wants her life to not get any worse. Joah was very satisfied with what he heard, and a small smile spread across his face. He went on to say that he was satisfied with everything, so he would watch them to make sure that what they said was done. After this meeting in the evening, Joah and his colleagues went to a karaoke bar, where he relaxed, singing his favorite song. The commander told him that he had heard that he had stolen 2 big cases from Team B. However, the detective continued to sing, while the police danced around him and a doctor sat on the side with a glass of wine. She was watching Joah closely. He noticed this when he turned his gaze to the side. The girl looked down and raised her glass up. In response, he nodded slightly and smiled. Suddenly, the assistant shouted, raising her glass, that the case was solved. So we should drink to that to the very bottom. Driving through the city streets in a white car, Wafei asked how the detective was feeling. She looked at the policeman, who was looking out the window with his hand propping up his beard, and asked if he had had too much to drink. Zhu smilingly replied that if he hadn't kissed her yet, it didn't seem like much. Watching the road carefully, Wah emphasized how straightforward he was. She added that, to be honest, his house was in a completely different direction from hers. This made the policeman wonder if they were on the wrong way, but she was still taking him home. Does she really need something from him? The girl noticed that he was thinking, so she said she would tell him something. She began by saying that today a body was brought to Q City from the Qinshan Reservoir. To be present at his feast, she had only completed half of the autopsy and had to return to finish the work. Joah reflected on what she had said. She had only finished half of the autopsy and came with such an appetite, just a master of her craft. His thoughts were interrupted by Wah, who said that her hands had touched many corpses. Then she asked if he wanted to kiss her again. The detective emphasized that they did not die at her hands. If he could have died at the hands of a beauty like her, he would have no complaints. The girl looked at him mysteriously. Then she smiled and lightly pressed the brakes to stop. She said, "Here we are." After that, Joah opened the door and began to carefully get out of the car. However, he stopped for a second and said that he had no one at home. Turning around to face Va, he leaned on the door and invited her to come in and sit for a while. And if she needed to improve her skills in examining corpses, he could pretend to be dead. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and smiled sweetly. She sped off, pressing the gas pedal hard. Joah remained standing on the sidewalk watching her go. He remembered how he had asked her to come to his place. The girl apologized and said that maybe another time, when she brought her surgical knife with her. Climbing the stairs to his floor, the man heard someone crunching loudly. Taking a few more steps, he saw feet in front of him, wearing light-colored, small-sized sneakers. He decided to look up to see who it was, and he was surprised by what he saw. A black-haired girl in a purple hoodie was nibbling on a red apple. She turned to him, saying how hard it was to find him. She sat down on one of the steps, and then leaning down to sneeze a little, she added that he was having a good time. Joah smiled and asked what she was talking about, because he was busy investigating the case. She put the apple in his mouth and asked him loudly if he had forgotten what he had done at the parent-teacher conference. Then she burst into tears and said that she just wanted to earn some money to help her family with their expenses. And in the end, she asked him if it was that hard. She sat down and wiped her tears and said that if they found out what she was doing, she would be able to continue her studies. Then how could she continue to study? The detective approached her and put his hand on her back and asked what had happened. Maybe he could help her with something. The girl smiled and asked if it was true. The next day, the curator came for a home visit. He began to tell her that it was almost time for the high school entrance exams, and he said that as a father, Joah should be concerned about his child. After all, Xiaoqing is one of the best students. The detective smiled sweetly as he listened and thought that she could become a good actress with such a talent for deceiving people. In the alley near the house, the girl offered the teacher a tray of apples. He said he didn't want any. The policeman and the young lady looked at each other. The man's gaze was filled with a question about whether his father would suddenly come running, and the girl told him with her eyes to relax, because she was tracking his geolocation. Therefore, he should be in the hospital now. The detective realized that pretending to be a father was very boring. He began to remember the conversation he had with the doctor yesterday. He wondered if she had finished the autopsy and where she was now. When he finished with the curator, I came to the office of Group A. Opening the door, I started shouting, "Xin is my sister." When he saw her, he said how she was looking at the investigation of the new case. He hugged Wang Fei and offered his help, and he whispered in her ear, asking if she would have time in the evening. They could talk about her investigation. A colleague interrupted their cooing. She showed him the sheet, adding that he had a lot to do today. He quickly grabbed the sheet and told her not to worry about the investigation, because Ku Ping and her team were already on it. Shin added that the group had decided to provide him with a new phone, so he could throw away the old one. On the sheet was a message about a police training session that would take place in the afternoon. The training site, someone's bare foot was gingerly stepping on the light tiles. Joah was lying on the floor, looking at something on his phone, thinking that the system had recently been producing some strange items, namely binoculars, 3 object composition indicators, a signal blocker, and an air quality detector. And he remembered that sometimes when he sneezed, the system would give him a trigram. He was interrupted from his thoughts by a noise in the room because everyone said that Meow's sister had come. She was dressed in a white top and short jean shorts. She was holding a bag in one hand and a water bottle in the other. Then she opened it and started drinking small sips. However, the water began to run down her cheeks and then down her neck and onto her chest. With wide eyes of wonder, Joah asked the man standing next to him who the girl was. The man replied that she seemed to be a detective and very beautiful. Without hesitation, the policeman standing in front of her began to talk to her and greeted her. And then, shaking hands, he said that he saw that she had just arrived and had not yet seen the pain techniques that they had already been shown. So he offered his help. The girl stood there not understanding what this man wanted from her at all. Her colleagues were watching them and talking among themselves about what he was doing, whether he was crazy, because she is a martial arts master. She is a 2-time champion in elite sparring, and there are few people who would be a worthy opponent for her. None of the criminals she caught had good results. All of them became disabled after meeting her. The last one summarized that it turns out Joah is in mortal danger. The girl smilingly took the detective's outstretched hand and smilingly replied, "Okay." Having climbed into the ring, the lady stood in one of the corners and listened to what the man was telling her, namely that he would first teach her the elbow grip. He waved his index finger at her and told her to attack him, and the girl began to quickly wave her fists in front of him. One of the punches that was aimed at his face, Zhao caught with one hand. He said a loud bam. Everyone gathered around the market and watched closely to see what was happening. He grabbed her hand by the wrist and began to spin her around. While doing so, he told her to watch, because it was very simple. He put his hand behind the girl's back and happily added that the main thing was to hold her hand, just like he was doing now. The girl looked up and smiled and said that she felt as if she could come out of it. Joah was still smiling awkwardly and asked how she was going to do it. But just then the brunette hit him in the face with her fist with all her strength. The man squinted his eyes in pain, and a large bruise remained on his cheek where the blow had been made. The detective was surprised because he did not expect this. When he opened his eyes, he saw the lady in denim shorts flying at him again. This time she tried to kick him, but Joah fought back in time by raising his hand. However, he still flew into the corner of the market, which was behind him. He began to rub his wound lightly. Then he said to himself, "Damn, not bad." And then he remembered that he noticed that no one was approaching her. Now it is clear why. Because she pretends to be a gentlewoman, but she is a karateka. Others are afraid of her, so they keep their distance. While he was thinking about this, the girl was kneading the wrist he was holding her by. Then she moved a little closer to him and began to smile sweetly, and at first apologized. But then she added that she hadn't calculated her strength, so she hoped he wouldn't be angry. A second later, she bowed her head and said gently that maybe he would teach her how to grab the neck. Smiling, the policeman said that he actually knew how to get out of the chokehold. The girl pretended to be surprised and asked what it was. Then she started waving her arms in front of him again, and muttered that if he was not afraid that she could break his arm, he could come over. The detective took a swing, but the girl managed to dodge it. Then she looked at him carefully and thought that he was going to hit her in the face or something. While she was thinking about it, he had already grabbed her arm and forced her to bend over. Joah happily asked her how it felt. This made her really angry, and she shouted for him to let her go. Carefully leaning behind her, he whispered in her ear, "I'm sorry, but the blow was so painful. He can't move now." They stood in the middle of the ring in a strange pose, and everyone watching began to laugh out loud. The detective continued to whisper. He told her to call him Brother Yu, and he would teach her many techniques. The whole situation made the girl very angry, as you could see from her expression. So she gritted her teeth and tilted her head forward. And then she raised it sharply upwards, and with this action struck a new blow, but almost in the same place. Joah stepped back a little and began to hold his nose, which was hurting badly. He opened his eyes again, cautiously. I saw the lady throw her leg up high. She tried to kick again, but the man managed to catch her and said that her leg was very nice. They stood in this position for several minutes. Joah held the limb with one hand and put the other in his pocket. The girl was furious at what she heard. The detective said that although he had hit her well, he was not strong enough. The girl was already boiling with rage, so she closed her eyes and clenched her teeth very tightly. Then she suddenly kicked with her other foot and tried to grab him by the neck in the air. When we landed on the ground, the man was lying on the ground, and the brunette was holding him with her legs. Then she turned around, leaned over and raised her hand in a fist to punch him directly in the face. Joah looked her in the eye with a stern look. What she saw made her think about what to do next, so she said a long, At this point, the policeman acted very cunningly, as he bit into her arm with his teeth. This caused the girl a lot of pain, and she screamed, "Ah!" throughout the room. And then, without hesitation, she used her other hand to punch him right in the nose, shouting that he had hurt her very badly. Watching this scene, the commander shouted what these two were doing here. They were putting on a free show. So he ordered them to get up quickly. They got up, but continued to look at each other angrily. The main man, spreading his arms wide, continued to ask what they came here to lie on top of each other, and a second later he added that it was a disgrace. The girl turned to Joah and told him not to get in her eyes anymore, because if she saw him, she would just leave. The man replied that he wanted to tell her the same thing. Then he asked if she thought she had scared him with her threat. The commander shouted to interrupt the argument and said that they still could not calm down. Tomorrow they have to leave here. Let their boss teach them well how to behave. Suddenly, the detective had a transparent screen with information that the happy meeting was 51% complete and a night vision device had been received. At this time, the deputy chief of the hospital said that they must be joking. After all, he was still new, and he had been fooling around all day. He was saying all this to a man who was standing in the ward and looking at something in a large window. The deputy asked the man if he was sure he wanted to make him his successor. The man replied that his perseverance and fighting spirit were stronger than any attacker's. Therefore, he should not be underestimated. Smiling, the captain added that he had already taken care of everything and hid his hands in the pockets of his striped pajamas. However, first we need to work on his character. Tired, Joah said with a cigarette in his mouth, that this was the house where the deceased lived. He and his assistant began to look at it carefully from a distance. She was walking behind him and said that he had just returned from training and had been sent to investigate a case with missing details. She asked why he didn't just refuse. The detective asked if not everyone was investigating. The girl said that it was a very old case, and then she asked him if he realized how difficult it was. The man replied that no one had been able to solve it for 10 years. So he started looking at the front door, and then he turned his head back, smiling, and said, "Because there was no one there." He touched the walls of the building and added that as soon as they had solved the case, he would treat her to something very tasty. Opening the door carefully, he took a few steps to enter the room. I saw a couch right in front of me with a pile of empty bottles next to it, and behind it was a large window. Joah began to imagine everything, and said that 10 years ago at 8 in the evening it was raining with loud thunder. The victim, named Yu Ji-geng, was lying on his couch. At the time of the crime, a blurry figure appeared in the alleyway of the neighborhood, but because there were no CCTV cameras nearby, that's all the information the police have. They have very little evidence. The victim was stabbed more than 40 times, which led to a quick death. Not a single fingerprint or trace of the killer was found at the crime scene. Even the door handle was completely untouched. Therefore, there are two options. Either the victim opened the door himself, or the killer had a key. The criminal left the inscription, "Everyone pays for their debts," on the wall, written in the victim's blood. If he wanted revenge, he would not have written the word debt. However, if he did owe him a debt, it was not necessary to impale the victim 40 times. The killer left a pool of blood at the crime scene, and he added a misleading message to it. He asked the imaginary killer what his goal was. Everything was interrupted by the loud ringing of the phone in Joah's pocket. He quickly took it out and began to look at the caller. It turned out to be Yao Qi, so he pressed the green button to accept the call. In the receiver, he heard a sweet voice asking him if he could take it, because she wanted to treat him to lunch. The detective said yes, and in a few minutes he was sitting with the girl in the restaurant. She said that she had been wanting to treat him for a long time, because if not for him, her bag would have been stolen. Joah sat and ate his lunch, and then replied that it was nothing. Joah went on to say that the main thing was that her boyfriend had given her the bag. This caused him to pause for a few minutes, wondering if she really had a boyfriend. While he was thinking, the lady sadly said that she would not want to lose it. The policeman stopped eating and tried to think about it carefully, so he sat there with a sad expression on his face. Then he said that if she had something to say, she should say it directly, and he would help her in any way he could. After saying that, he continued to eat. Yu happily quickly asked if he could check on her boyfriend. Joah had heard that her boyfriend was always borrowing money from her, so she is afraid that he might have gotten into some trouble. He was saying all this to someone on the phone while looking at the transparent screen that said the completion rate was 59%, and that a stealth detector was provided. The assistant said into the phone that the guy's name was Tsang Jie, and as soon as she found something on him, she would inform the detective. He replied with a thank you, and then added that if they met, they would go play billiards together. The girl laughed and replied that he shouldn't do that, but rather treat her to something. Suddenly Joah's attention was drawn to a woman walking with a child by the hand to a moped. It was Lin Maifeng, formerly the wife of the late Yu Jigeng, who is the main suspect in this case. She endured her husband's beatings for a long time. She even had a miscarriage once. Her husband even threatened her entire family that he would break her father's leg. On the night of her husband's death, Lin Maifeng was in the hospital helping her cousin with childbirth. So she has an ironclad alibi. The next day, when she saw her husband's corpse, she was scared to death. Her neighbors helped her call the police. After that, she tried to commit suicide many times and ended up in the hospital because of depression. She barely managed to recover from all that and got married for the second time, and now she's having a good time. But what will happen if she turns out to be the killer? The detective said to himself. His thoughts were interrupted by the phone ringing. Picking up the phone, Yu received the news that he had found the person he needed. He began to tell him that he was manufacturing defective goods at his factory and would be going to the wholesale market today to sell them. And in the end, he added that he would send the location of the warehouse. Upon arrival, Joah started to smoke a cigarette and noticed that a transparent screen appeared with a message that the system was successfully launched. Suddenly, he heard someone shouting "Stop" loudly, so I started looking around to see what was happening, and he saw a young man with shoulder-length hair running away from a woman who was shouting where he was going, and at the end she added that he should stop immediately. The policeman immediately tripped the young man. He fell to the floor, and all the things from his purse flew around. While he was trying to recover from such a hard landing, Joah picked up a small folder from the floor. He began to examine it because he did not really understand what it could be. Suddenly he was pushed away by a girl who was very quickly making her way to the long-haired young man and shouted at the policeman that he had run out of the way and was not in the way. Then she pushed off the floor and jumped on the man, saying that she would show him how to run. Watching the couple fight, Joah was holding his injured nose and saying "frozen," and wondering why they had to beat him like that. So he decided to intervene and ran up to them, pushed the girl away with his hand and asked her to move away. And then he struck the young man in the face, telling him to try it again. The lady standing behind him held her shoulder, and crying said that he dared to push her away. So she put her hand on Joah's back and looked at him with contempt, and he looked her right in the eye. For a few seconds, each tried to prove something to the other with their eyes. Then the girl decided that she should strike first, so she jumped up high and pointed her foot at the detective. He, in turn, stretched his hand forward, made into a fist, And then the fight just started. Seeing this, people started rushing to them to separate them. Joah, who was being held by one of the men, shouted to the lady that he had helped her catch this bastard, and for that he was thanked. The girl replied that she didn't know if he was in cahoots with him. The policeman told her to stay out of his sight because if he saw her again, she would regret it. Captain Meow shouted back a short but clear, "Likewise." After everything that happened, the detective pulled out his phone and began to look at the location of the warehouse and realized that he had gotten farther away from the point he needed to go, because he had forgotten about the main case because of that lady. Taking a small folder out of his pocket, which he had managed to take with him, he said how much it hurt, because this girl had a pretty bad blow. It turned out to be a wallet with a photo in it. It was a picture of a young man whom the detective had stopped with his foot a few minutes ago, and he began to think about what this young man had done, why he was caught. Under this card was another photo of a woman Joah recognized as Lee Mifeng. He asked himself the logical question why the photo of the suspect was in this wallet. Arriving at the police station, the detective made inquiries and it turned out to be Liu Pengfei, 41 years old and engaged in wholesale sales. The cards in his wallet totaled about 1,000,000 yen, and he also owns 3 houses and 2 cars. The detective asked what he had to do with Lin Mifeng. The assistant said that he had nothing to do with her, but he and Yu Zhigang were from the same city. The young man who was looking for all the information in the computer said laughing that no one had been able to solve this case for 10 years. And then he asked Joah that he just picked up the wallet and found the evidence. And in the end, he added that he was very lucky. The detective sat down on the floor and began to look at the transparent screen, which said that the meeting was successful. The degree of completion was 80%, and an invisible listening device was obtained. Having read everything carefully, I said that it was the system's tricks again. Then he began to look closely at the photo of the woman he found in his wallet, and assumed that it could have been taken secretly, so he decided to ask Liu Pengfei, as he must know her well. His assistant suggested that if he kept her picture in his wallet, he might be secretly in love with her. Suddenly, a man came into the office with a folder and said that they had taken 4 fingerprints and looked at their history in the database. It turned out that he had already been investigated several times for minor offenses, but this time he had seriously injured someone and was now being investigated by Department Y. The programmer said that they needed to find out who this guy really was, but now he was being held in that department. The assistant leaned her head on her hand and said, "Maybe someone knows someone there." Everyone began to remember, but it turned out that they did not. That's when Joah came to the police station. When he entered the door, he began to smile sweetly. And Yao, as soon as she saw him, said, "It can't be, you have the nerve." Leaning against the wall, the girl folded her arms across her chest and asked if he had come to make a mess again. The detective came closer to her and said that she was talking as if he was some kind of maniac. However, he had business to attend to, so he asked her to leave her personal questions alone for now. After reviewing the sheet that Joah brought, the lady handed it back to him, saying that if he wanted to interrogate Liu Pengfei, this sheet was not enough. She asked him to bring all his official documents from the investigation, and then they would talk. The detective angrily replied that it would take a month for official documents. He didn't have time to wait that long, so he asked if he could help her with something else. He leaned over and smiled slyly, saying that last time she had let him bite her ass. Then he asked if she was still angry. The girl pushed him away and said that anyone could come to interrogate him, but not him. And then she pointed her index finger at the door and shouted that he should go back where he came from. The policeman only smiled in response, showing his white teeth. But a second later he became serious because he heard the phrase, "Where did this guy come from?" Did he want to get help from their department? And he dared to make Captain Meow angry, and now he will not live. All of this was discussed aloud by the workers in the room. Joah decided to ask if the lady was sure she didn't want to help him. But when he didn't get an answer, he started moving towards the girl's colleagues, asking if she believed that he could cut off their department from the world. He sat down on the table, put his foot on it, and confidently said that he had a superpower and could make the whole room go without communication, and all their computers and phones would be left without a signal. The girl, thinking about what he said what? And then laughing, added superpower means. The colleagues behind her also expressed their thoughts. One said he was a living blocker. It seems he fell off a camel on his head. Another said maybe Joah has a wild imagination, or he's just sick. Meow added, if he leaves the whole station without a signal. And approaching the detective, she said that then she would allow him to enter the suspect's room. The policeman addressed the girl by name, and then he hugged her by the shoulders and happily said that he hoped she would keep her word. After that, he pressed her against the wall, looked her in the eye, and said that it was time to recite a spell for her. The lady pushed him away and ordered a colleague standing behind her to bring a signal detector. Suddenly, the detective began to shout loudly at the entire station. Captain Meow is a fool! Captain Meow is a fool! This made the girl very angry, and she clenched her hand into a fist and angrily said, Joah, you wanted to kill me. Suddenly, she was interrupted and told that the signal had indeed disappeared. The subordinates reported to the captain that the lower part of the room was completely empty. They also reported that the detector could not track it either. Meow pulled out her smartphone and saw the words "no signal" on the screen, so she turned to face the detective, who could see her anger and irritation at what had happened. Joah put his foot down and smilingly asked if he could now interrogate the suspect, and at the end he added, Ka-pi, Tan, Meow. Then the events unfolded in the interrogation room. Liu Pengfei, the murder suspect, was already sitting there. A detective entered the room, loudly opening the door wide and startling the man. With his hands in his pants pockets, the policeman looked at Liu with a steady gaze. Suddenly, someone's hand pushed the officer so hard that he did not enter, but simply ran into the room. It turned out that this blow was delivered by the captain, who had told him not to block the passage when she came in behind him. This picture surprised the suspect even more. Sitting on the chairs in front of Liu, the girl folded her arms across her chest and began to think about what was wrong with the detective and how it happened that the signal really disappeared. At the same time, Joah was thinking that it was good that he had an invisible signal jammer, which was located in his right pants pocket. That's why they really believed in his superpower. While he was sitting there with his arms across his chest, he decided to use the invisible lie detector. He told the suspect that when he started asking him questions, he would have to answer only yes or no. He answered with a short yes, and Meow quietly said to herself what this guy was up to again. The first question was, yes, are you a man? The suspect answered yes. A green light came on the transparent screen. The detective said, I see. After all, if it's true, it's green, and if it's a lie, it's red. The second question was, are you a woman? The man answered no, and the green light came on. The third question, your name is Liu Pengfei. The answer is yes, and the light turns green again. Fourth, do you like pies? No. Green light. And 5. Did you kill Yu Jiguang? At first this question came out of the blue, so it surprised the suspect and made him think. Then he shouted no loudly, and a red light came on the screen. It signaled a lie. Joah jumped to his feet, leaned his hands on the table, and said that he was lying to him right now. Then he grabbed him by the shirt and started shouting that Jiguang knew his wife Lin Meifeng. In the end, he asked if it was true. A girl who was present at the interrogation also jumped to her feet and suggested that the detective calm down and let the man go. The suspect replied that he didn't really know her. Gao began to wonder if he was the killer. After all, why did he get so nervous after a few questions asked him? Then she turned her gaze to the detective and said, what does this Zhao Yu know? After calming down, the officer sat back down at the table and began to draw a turtle on a sheet of paper and speculate that this guy was a murderer. This made the man pause for a few minutes in thought, and his head began to boil from all the thoughts because there was no evidence. So he decided to come up with a way to make this man confess. While I was thinking about it, I watched Meow through the open door, who was standing in front of her colleague and carefully reading something on a sheet of paper. When his colleague left, the detective opened the door and began to smile as he looked through it. He approached the brunette from behind, gently put his elbow on her shoulder, and asked if they could talk. In response, I heard a short, "Of course," after which a smile appeared on the girl's face. This confused the man a bit. He wondered why she suddenly began to treat him so warmly. After the conversation, the girl pointed to the photo and said that it was an inscription left at the crime scene in the FM district, and it matches the handwriting of the suspect by 91%. She was telling him and showing him all this. He sat silently at the table with his head bowed. Miao went on to describe the height of the dark figure caught on the surveillance camera that night as a perfect match. She added that he had done everything he could to leave no fingerprints at the scene. However, they did manage to find one single piece of evidence that did not belong to the victim. The killer's hair. It was a perfect match to the suspect's hair. The last sentence frightened the man. He even clenched his teeth in excitement, and then he shouted that it was impossible, and that they were slandering him and demanded a lawyer. Joah watched the man's violent reaction closely. Miao turned to face the detective and quietly said that this would not work, and added that maybe the hell with it. The man coughed and asked to take a closer look. He surprised the lady because she was ready to give up. The detective approached the suspect and showed him a small piece of paper, saying that in addition to physical evidence, they also have a witness. It turned out that it was a photo of the victim's ex-wife, which the policeman had found in the man's wallet. With big eyes of surprise, he said, She told everything. Joah began to think quickly about what this gentleman could be talking about. He confidently put his hand on the table and continued his cunning game. So he asked the man if he had just realized it. The captain, looking at the detective, began to think that this guy, but this was interrupted by the thought that Joah had solved 2 crimes in a row and deserved praise. But he was still sent to investigate a 10-year-old case. Was it because of his disruptive nature? Then she remembered how 15 minutes ago the detective had told her that he was sure that the suspect was the killer and offered to put on a show for him. A little work on his evidence would make him nervous enough so that he would confess to the crime himself. The girl emphasized that the detective was very persistent. The suspect bowed his head and briefly said that they were right, and sadly added that he had killed Guang. This answer surprised the detective and Miao, because they did not expect to hear it so quickly. So they turned to each other at the same time, and you could see the joy in their eyes, because they managed to do it. The suspect began to say that he and Li Meifeng had signed an agreement, or rather a contract, to exchange murders. What he said alerted the police, and they simultaneously said, "What?" After that, Joah began to recall seeing her with the baby, happy and smiling, and asking if she was a murderer as well. The suspect continued that he and Guang went to the same high school. At that time, he fell in love with a girl named Xiaoqin. He was unable to win the girl's heart, so he spread rumors that she had already slept with him. His lies spread like wildfire, and in a short time, the whole village knew about it. Everyone laughed when they saw her and started whispering about it. After a short period of time, Xiaoqin was forced to leave school and move to another city to find a job. Sometime later, he heard rumors that she had started working as a prostitute. For him, Guang fully deserved to die. Miao added, because of this, he asked Lin Meifeng to go to his house and kill your wife, Yizian Wenli. The thought, did this bastard kill his wife too, flashed through the detective's mind. And then, looking at the brunette, he noticed that it was not surprising that she changed her attitude and began to help him. She just needed his help to make her confess everything. What a woman. The policewoman put her hands at her sides and asked in a serious tone why the man had ordered Jian Wenil's murder. To which the killer calmly replied that he had wanted her dead from the very beginning. After all, she had never respected him. His work, the house they lived in, everything was arranged by her father, and he was just her nanny, who cleaned up all the garbage after her. Therefore, he had to deal with those men with whom she cheated on him without hesitation. At the same time, the woman was silently and calmly watching him over her shoulder with her head held high. After a while, he saw in the movie how people made a contract to exchange murders. After that, he found Lin Meifeng, because she had endured her husband's beatings for so many years, so he knew that somewhere deep inside, she hated him. And with her help, he could not only avenge Xiaoqin, but also kill his own wife. However, she refused his offer and the case was postponed, and as a result, this bastard beat her almost to death, which caused her to miscarry, and she came to him, agreeing to the proposal. They signed a consent and recorded everything on a dictaphone. On the day his wife died, he was at the factory. And on the day of Yu Zhigang's death, she was in the hospital helping a relative give birth, so they both had an alibi. In any case, the man emphasized that he had lived a good life for 10 years, and now, having confessed everything, he felt relieved. The policeman stood calmly and silently listening attentively to every word of the killer. After that, the action unfolded in a street snack bar where they raised their beer glasses high, loudly saying that the case was solved. Everyone present at this event began to praise Joah. One said he should confess because he was Sherlock Holmes from another planet. Just great, because it took their department 10 years to solve this crime. The girls were talking to each other. One said that she thought that murder-for-hire cases only happened in movies. Another said that if Joah Yu had joined their department earlier, they would not have had to deal with this case so much. Sipping his beer slowly, the detective reflected that he was in awe of Liu Peifei's courage, how he managed to persuade Lin Meifeng to help him kill a man. Wasn't he afraid that she might ruin everything? Suddenly, a transparent screen appeared, displaying a message saying that the degree of completion was 90%, and that 3 invisible surveillance cameras had been obtained. A few hours ago, Zhao was gently holding Miao's hand. He shook her lightly, and thanked her for her pleasant cooperation. She replied that she would tell the details of the 2 cases to her boss. After that, they would both cooperate in the investigation of the case. She added that she would send him all the details. At this time, the man took out his phone and looked at something on it and said that it was good, so he would return to the station and close the case. Miao emphasized that first she needed to get an arrest warrant for Lin Meifeng. The man froze for a moment. The lady decided to stir him up a bit by asking him what happened. The detective said that he could not believe that that nice woman with a baby was a murderer. The policewoman said that it was not yet certain. Let him come to the police station first, and then they would find out. As he continued to drink beer from a large glass, Joah was thinking that Miao was not only beautiful and intelligent, but she had a gentle hand and soft skin. Suddenly, a loud phone call rang throughout the room. Of course, it was the detective on the phone. Pulling out his smartphone, he began to look at who was bothering him. It turned out that it was the police brunette he had just been thinking about. She told him to come to the police station as soon as possible. The detective quickly arrived at the scene. Despite the fact that it was already quite late, he ran through the front door where Miao was already waiting, emphasizing that he had come quickly enough. Leaning over the sheet to catch his breath, he said that he had called a taxi and offered to tell her what had happened in detail. The girl watching him began to wonder if he was drunk. But she decided to tell him that they had just interrogated Lin Meifeng, and she said that she had used a knife and stabbed Jian Wenli to death. However, the autopsy report clearly showed that the victim died of strangulation. Joah put his hand to his mouth, thinking that he had forced the driver to drive faster, but he felt like he was going to vomit. Leaning on the wall with his hand, he continued to listen to the police officer's story, that the victim's body did have stab wounds, but they were not deep. He assumed that since she had already confessed to everything, she has no reason not to lie. The detective suggested that it was possible that Jian's killer was not Lin Meifeng at all. The girl began to think about this idea. She suggested that he look at the letters, and several shoe prints were found at the crime scene, but Lin Meifeng said she had put on shoe covers before she entered the house. In addition, to make it look like a robbery, Lin Meifeng ransacked all the valuables in the west bedroom, but according to the crime scene report, the east bedroom was also turned over. Joah added that it turns out that on the day of Jian Wenli's murder, there was a third person at the crime scene. He could barely contain himself as he was feeling very nauseous. Miao emphasized that it was very possible that this person had strangled Jian Wenli first. Joah interrupted, saying to let him think. However, this did not stop the girl, and she continued to say that Lin Maifeng came and stabbed her, or maybe she mistakenly believed that she had killed her, but not really. After saying this, she turned to face the policeman, who at this time had already puffed out his cheeks. And then at that second he threw up right on the floor in front of Meow. But it turned out that she got a little bit of it, and this made the lady very angry. When Joah cleaned himself up a bit, they moved to the interrogation room, where he calmly said that they really needed the woman to answer the questions. He added that she would only have to answer yes or no. The lady answered briefly, yes. The first question was whether she had killed Jian Wenli. The suspect answered yes. However, the transparent lie detector turned on a red light, and this made Joah think because he thought she was not lying. So why was the red light on? So the man asked a second question. Was the victim killed with a knife? The woman answered yes. The officer wondered if she really believed that she had stabbed Jian Wenli, or if she was deliberately covering up for the killer. The third question was whether she knew who Jian Wenli's killer was. The lady was a little bit thrown off by this question and asked, "What? If it wasn't her?" The detective asked her to just answer yes or no. The suspect answered yes, and the red light came on, which surprised him and stumped him. However, one conclusion was that she did not know who killed the victim. Then he asked the next question, and it was as follows. When she stabbed Jian Wenli, was the woman already dead at that time? The lady thought about it and answered that she did not really know. After all, she was very scared at the time and just stabbed her several times on her blanket. However, the victim did not move. The information received again made the police a little tense and think about all the facts. Smiling, the detective concluded that everything was clear. Lin Maifeng mistakenly believed that she had killed the victim, and that's great. Therefore, she was not the real killer at all. After the interrogation, Meow concluded that the suspect had confessed to the crime. It would be logical for them to close the case. While smoking a cigarette on the roof, Joah said what she had heard. When she pierced the blanket with a knife, she didn't even know whether she was alive or not. The girl folded her arms across her chest and said that as a senior officer, she had to remind him. If they close the case now, everything will be much easier for them. Medals, awards, praise. If not, they will have to continue to puzzle over the case and work from morning to night to catch the real killer. 10 years have passed. If they start the investigation again, now, and Jian Wenli's family finds out about it, they will not rest until they get to the bottom of the truth, which will be an additional pressure for the police. And everything will be fine if they find it, but if they don't, they'll be hunted down again with mud. You're not in a good position right now, and you have to realize that a case from a decade ago can cause a lot of problems. She said everything she needed to say, and now she wants to hear his opinion. What should I do with this case? Should I close it or is it useless? Joah smiled, holding a cigarette between his teeth. He said that if she could close it with a calm soul, she wouldn't summarize it now. Besides, she would not have called him here at this late hour. She did not expect him to be able to put everything in its place like that. So she said, a little embarrassed, that she already regretted calling him because he had stained her with his vomit. Leaning over the lady, he said that he hoped she would not be vindictive, and then he offered to catch the real killer together. While the long-haired suspect was being led away, Joah, his assistant, and the programmer stood by the front door. The blond man, who was well versed in computers, asked if this was the killer who had been involved in the FM case. The detective replied that the department was still looking for his wife's killer, and he would keep him here for now, to deal with the case. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to what was happening on the street. Joah asked his assistant where this crowd of people was going. The girl said she remembered the case of the corpse in the Q reservoir. The suspect turned out to be an athlete named Tracer. The last time they caught him, they only managed to handcuff half of him, and he escaped. And now there was a report that 2 days ago, a man with handcuffs on his hands was seen near the reservoir. This description matches Yang Wentao, and they are going to catch him now. The detective said quietly that the corpse was found in the reservoir, and why he returned to the crime scene. The programmer added that there are many settlements near that place. It would take a long time to find him in this wilderness. Joah smilingly headed for the exit and said that he was also leaving. The assistant behind him shouted that the head of the department wanted to see him. The man replied that he needed to catch a criminal and added that he was sure the boss would understand. The girl said that this guy only thinks about the investigation. He is interested in getting promoted. 3 days later, Reservoir Q. The detective reasoned that in recent days the system has been giving him only navigation and signal boosters. She seems to be worried that he might get lost. While they were driving in the car, the assistant said to Joah that the villagers had reported seeing Yang Wentao in the western part of the reservoir. So why are they going east? The man with the cigarette in his mouth said seen does not mean he is still there. The police had already searched the entire settlement and had no luck. Suddenly, through the window, he noticed a red-haired girl standing with her back to him, talking to a man. The man was smiling back at her, and Joah remembered that she looked like someone from Miao Ying's entourage. If so, he wondered what she was doing here. Then she waved and thanked the gentleman, calling him Officer Liu. Joah got out of the car and approached the young lady and asked who he was. But she did not see anyone standing next to her, and when she turned her head, she screamed out loud, "God damn it," because she was scared. And running to the car, she said that it was the detective who was investigating the Jian Wenli case at the time. He retired a few years ago, and now lives here. The officer recalled how Miao told him to take the long-haired suspect away and close the case, and she, in turn, would send people to talk to the officer who had investigated the whole thing 10 years ago to find out the details. And the man said out loud that he had been so busy lately that he hadn't even been able to call the police officer. She had promised him that she would send him all the information he needed about the case, but he hadn't received anything, so he decided to ask the redhead how the investigation was going. While waiting for an answer, he took a pen from the girl's hand and told her that it was a dictaphone, with which she had recorded a conversation she had had a few minutes earlier with a former detective. The girl recalled how she had once asked Miao if she should send all the information she had received to Joah. She replied that it was not necessary, because they had agreed that they would investigate together, and he had gone to catch the criminal in the reservoir, and since he was busy, they would. The redhead took the pen away. She said that she had the right to confidentiality, and hid the recorder in a pocket on the chest of her blouse. Joah said there were 2 departments working on the case, and what is there to hide anyway? The lady turned her back on him, took hold of the car door handle, and said that if he had any questions, he could ask her captain. The detective held the door with his hand and said that if he wanted something, no one had the right to refuse him. The lady was a little scared by this act. However, their fight was interrupted by Joah's assistant, who called him to stand a little to the side. She asked him why they suddenly stopped here. This allowed the redhead to quickly get into the car and start it. She pressed the gas pedal as hard as she could, and the car started to fly as if it were flying. The assistant clarified who the girl was. As the car drove away from them, the detective remembered how he managed to pull a pen out of the young lady's pocket while she was looking at his assistant, and said that she had decided to play with him or something. She added with a sly smile that she was too young for that. Turning on the recorder while driving, I heard the following words. He is at least 6 feet tall and limps on his right leg. In addition, pieces of dirt were found on Jian's body. The killer most likely pushed her against the wall before strangling her. Suddenly, the phone rang loudly. Joah pulled it out of his pocket and picked up the phone to hear Miao yelling at him to return the recorder immediately. The detective first said, "What recorder? What are we talking about?" The captain told him to stop pretending. She added that he should listen carefully to the fact that Lin Maifeng's stationery store was destroyed, and Liu Pengfei's pantry was also set on fire. Jian Wenli's parents began to rage. They demanded that the police catch the culprit as soon as possible. So she asked Joah to return to the police station. In response, he asked to send him all the materials for now, and added that he would return as soon as he had dealt with his case. Stopping at a gas station to fill up on fuel and meat, a redhead, who happily took the recorder, saying, "They say there are a lot of cliffs here." She got into her car and added that since he was not familiar with the area, she advised him to drive carefully. Otherwise, he would fall off a cliff and they would have to look for his corpse. Joah, licking his ice cream, thought about the words and said a long, and suddenly the words "not familiar with the area" came to mind. So he quickly ran to the assistant and asked her to check what Yang Wentao was doing. The girl entered his data into the tablet and began to read that the man was a clerk in a technology bureau. Then she asked what was the big deal. The detective said that as a civil servant, he could have participated in site survey projects and might have come here. No wonder why he was hiding near the reservoir. He just knows the region well. Next, I asked my colleague if he had participated in any large-scale research projects related to Reservoir Q. The girl answered that it was the Reformation in the old Silver Spring, the village of U. He had been involved in the project for 3 years. He knew the area and had been here many times. She added that the village was quite close to them. She emphasized that Joah had guessed right again. Smiling, he happily suggested that they go to the village. They arrived at the motel when it was very dark, and a large, lonely moon was shining brightly in the sky. The assistant changed into a silk dress to go to bed, and asked the detective if it was night, and if he was going to go to bed. Looking at the map on his phone, he told her to go to bed for now. The girl calmly said goodnight. After that, while having a smoked chicken leg for dinner, Joah began to think that the suspect was searching for silver and knew about the cave mines and where to hide. But the map showed that there were a lot of them in the area. The man's thoughts were interrupted by a bark. It turned out that there was a dog standing right in front of him, watching him closely, with warm saliva coming out of its mouth. The detective looked at the smoked leg and began to think about whether to give it to the dog or keep it for himself. When he came to a convenience store, he asked the seller to give him another chicken leg, and then he threw it to the dog, telling him to eat it. While I was watching this, I wondered if the suspect was hiding in the mine, what he was eating there. Perhaps he hides only during the day and goes to town at night to buy food. After showing the photo of the man he was looking for to the animal, he said it would be good if he turned out to be a police dog. However, he asked him to look at this murderer. He asked if the dog was familiar with him, and if he could find the man for him. After all this, the detective started laughing out loud. He said that he seemed to have had too much to drink. After finishing the chicken leg, the dog turned around and ran loudly, barking as if calling after him. So Joah did not hesitate to follow him, and as he walked, he began to wonder if he could really know the suspect. Suddenly, the dog stopped and sat down on the ground. The detective tried to get away from him, because they were moving very fast through the forest. The man even began to sweat on his face. At the same time, he saw an incomprehensible pile in front of him, so he asked himself if he was imagining things. But after a good look, he added, "What the hell," because it turned out to be dog shit. This made the policeman angry, and he was upset that he had come all this way in vain. However, he heard a phone call, and it wasn't his, so he pulled out his own and started shining his flashlight in the area where the sound was coming from, and saw someone running away among the trees. Joah noticed half of a pair of handcuffs on one hand. He remembered the assistant telling him that the suspect was a tracerum athlete, and that the last time they caught him, they had only half of the handcuffs on him before he escaped. The detective was very amused by this and said to himself that this man would not escape now. However, running after him through the forest at night was not very easy. After all, in the dark, you can't see anything properly, and the flashlight on your phone doesn't give you the light you need. As the policeman continued to run, he reasoned that the suspect was a tracer, and that he knew the area well. And it seems to him that he will never catch him in such darkness. He stopped for a few seconds to think carefully about what to do next, how best to act, and a wonderful thought flashed through his mind, which brought a wide smile to his face. He decided to use the system's gift, because now was the right time. So he chose an invisible night vision device, plus invisible goggles. After running a few meters with this device, he saw a mine and its entrance in front of him. He went through the existing opening into the middle. Joah began to run quickly down a large, long corridor. After a few minutes, he came to a crossroads and had to figure out which way the suspect ran. Suddenly, he heard the dog barking again. He turned back and saw the animal that had led him to the forest. The dog started running into the tunnel on the left. This made the man very happy, and he said to the animal, "Well done, I believe in you." After a few meters, the detective heard the sound of handcuffs, but in front of him, he saw the suspect who continued to run forward. Joah shouted at him to stop. The police officer gained a little momentum and pushed off the ground. He jumped up high and struck the hooded gentleman. This knocked the flashlight out of his hands. However, the athlete did not give up and tried to get it. At that time, the detective grabbed him by one arm and put it behind his back, and smiling, he told him to try to run some more. However, the suspect managed to pull a knife out of his other hand and bring it to the policeman's face. He held it right between his eyes. He suddenly cut him on the left cheek, and then he quickly ran away down the mine tunnel. Sitting down in pain, the detective shouted loudly, "Bastards!" However, he turned his face in the direction where the fugitive ran. What had just happened made him very angry. However, it did not stop him, and he continued to pursue him. When he caught up with the athlete, he noticed that he had crawled into a small hole in the wall. He approached the hole calmly and carefully with small steps. At that time, the suspect was sitting behind the wall and prepared a knife to defend himself. He was waiting for what would happen next. He began to think about where the person who was chasing him had gone and why it had become so quiet. At that moment, there was a blow from the side that knocked the athlete to the ground and knocked the knife out of his hands very far away. Joah turned to him cheerfully, asking if he really thought he could outwit the officer. The suspect still tried to get to the lost weapon. However, he did not have time, because the policeman turned him on his back and punched him in the face, saying, "You like to brandish a knife." Then he inserted 2 fingers into the suspect's nostrils, and then he threw the man against the wall, saying, "Wave to me here." Suddenly, the detective felt dizzy. He began to think that he could not have gotten tired so quickly. Behind him, he saw a dog standing and barking at the entrance. This made Joah wonder why he was not suitable. And then a transparent screen appeared, and a message appeared saying that there was not enough oxygen. Please leave the room immediately. The policeman quickly began to put the other half of the handcuffs on one of his hands, and reasoned that he had guessed that there was too little air. Therefore, it was necessary to get out of here as soon as possible. But what he noticed next, it made him think. There was a bag in front of his feet, and he didn't know what was in it. The transparent screen appeared again, with green text saying that the air quality was satisfactory. At this time, the detective, looking at his phone, emphasized that the signal was not picking up at all. So he needed to think about how to get out of here, and he remembered that he had an invisible GPS signal booster. He quickly inserted it into his smartphone and called Peng Xin, saying that he would send his location. The caller replied that as soon as they received it, they would be on their way. After the conversation, Joah began to look again at the suspicious bag on his right side. But he decided to open it anyway, because it was so bulky that he was curious what was inside. And there was a pile of money, and the detective assumed that there were at least 100 pieces. Moreover, these were old bills, and now their price is twice as high. Continuing to look at the bag, he began to think about how so much money could have appeared in an old abandoned mine. Looking at his photo with the athlete that was taken in the cave, Joah slowly walked to his car. At the same time, the police officers who were taking the criminal away were talking among themselves that local residents had reported seeing the man they were looking for moving west. And they began to speculate how the detective managed to catch him on the east side and how he figured out this mine. Joah grabbed the door handle when one of his colleagues called out to him. However, the detective only said that Li Bain should still be at the hotel in room 211. He then asked him to pick her up on the way, as he was tired and would be heading home. However, he was holding a bag with the money he had found in the mine. Suddenly, he heard a light growl at his feet. The same dog was sitting next to him, looking him in the eye as if trying to ask him for something. The policeman tiredly told him to get in the car. Driving home, the man rejoiced that he had solved another case, and the dog was barking happily because he finally had an owner. Climbing the stairs, a transparent screen appeared on which it was written that an invisible X-ray machine had been received. The time of use is 10 minutes. The detective noticed that the system helped him out quite well today. When he got up to his floor, the dog began to sniff someone's black shoe, which was standing right in the corridor. As it turned out, a beaten young lady in a short white dress was sitting under the door. Everything he saw surprised Joah, and he could not help but say, "What the The girl opened her eyes a little and said, "Oh, it stinks." And before her eyes she saw the dog's face, which was sniffing her. The lady began to scream loudly because she was very scared. Joah calmly asked her why she was sleeping in the entrance at such a late hour. She replied that she had forgotten her keys inside, and she just decided to sit here and wait for her roommate, Sister Hong, to come home. And then she accidentally fell asleep. With a sideways glance, the detective noticed the wounds on her face and wondered if she had been beaten. Finally opening the door, the man went in first and then invited her to come in and rest. Then warm water flowed from the shower head. It turned out that this girl took it upon herself to wash the dog thoroughly, and while she was doing so, she asked the officer what his dog's name was. At that time, Joah was sitting on the couch eating a banana and answered the question as follows. Shit specialist. Being in the bathroom, the lady could not hear well due to the flow of water and asked again, "Shitty specialist?" The detective then began to wipe and dry the dog with a hairdryer, and while he was doing it, he was thinking that he was pretty damn handsome. The girl told him that it was a Bengal shepherd named Manhwa. This attracted the man's attention. She continued that the police often use them as search dogs. She added that her family breeds dogs of different breeds at home, and she is quite good at them. And after saying that, she began to carefully wipe her hair on her head. After that, she grabbed a banana that was lying on the surface. She heard Joah ask how old it could be. Peeling the fruit from the peel, the lady looked at the man and answered that it was about 2 or 3 years old. At this time, someone knocked on the door and the girl came up to it saying that she would open it. It turned out to be a blonde woman, who immediately asked why she hadn't waited for her in the stairwell. Then she added that she had heard her voice and decided to look in. The sister was listening with a banana shoved all the way into her mouth, and the detective was sitting on the floor next to the dog, also looking through the open door. And then the blonde woman made giant eyes of surprise and first said you and then you. Without saying anything, she went to her room, and her sister started to catch up with her, explaining that she had misunderstood everything, because she had just helped his dog take a shower and had gotten a little dirty. In the end, she added that nothing happened between them. Joah said to the dog that he had no malicious intentions, to which it responded by barking once. The next day, at Hogo Lee's restaurant, Baini said that she hadn't finished writing her report on the FM district killer. He had already caught the suspect in the Q reservoir. Then she added that her fingers had calluses all over them, and she still couldn't keep up with his speed in finding criminals. Team B hired a new employee, and Captain Ku Ping asked her to help him get his bearings. Joah, while pouring juice, asked if they had solved the case of the theft in the nursing home. The girl replied that it was a security guard. He saw the director collecting donations and keeping them in his office, so he changed the angle of the surveillance camera and hid all the money in the basement. The detective asked how the robbery was solved, and the lady replied that it was confusing that there was no record of the robbery. Captain Ku Ping immediately assumed it was someone from the inside. When she started questioning the servants, she found a new set of keys on one of the guards. He made a copy of the keys to the director's office, the control room, and the basement. That's how the crime was solved. Raising his glass of juice, Joah said, "You made a copy of the keys." And then he heard one man talking to another visitor in a harsh tone, telling him to get out of here if he was full. The man in the suit asked him what if he hadn't finished, and then began to slowly bring the roll to his mouth. Suddenly there was a bang from a beer bottle and glass shattered all around. It turned out that it was the insolent man who could not stand it, and hit the ordinary man on the head with this bottle, telling him to get out of here. But without hearing a response or seeing any movement, the man continued to be angry, and stood there with the surviving part of the bottle in his hand. The victim was very concerned about what he saw. At that time, a welcome poster for Chief Su Yan had already been put up in the R division. The bureau chief said that he would be arriving soon, so they had to finalize the distribution of positions. After all, they need to fully support him for the next few months. One of the policemen asked where Zhao Yu was, because Su Yan wants to see him. A female colleague replied that he had gone out with Li Baini. Other employees were whispering, saying, "Why was the head of the department sent here? What is he going to check?" After all, there are rumors that he is scary. The second guy added that he didn't know whether he was scary or not, but they say he is tall and red-faced, even a little bit like an alcoholic. In the restaurant, all the food he ordered flew in the victim's face, and the impudent man threatened him with a bottle and asked if it burned because of that. Suddenly, the bottle was knocked out of his hands with chopsticks. The man turned around to see who did it. It turned out to be Joah, who began to poke him with the same chopsticks, saying that if he came to eat, let him eat, and if not, let him get out of here. And squinting his eyes to make a menacing look, he added, "Did they want to eat in the cell?" The impudent one was afraid that it might be a policeman, so he suggested that his friends leave. The detective returned to his seat and said to his assistant that they would not let them eat properly. At that time, the girl was on the phone and said that she understood everything and they would be there soon. After the conversation, the colleague told Joah that the new chief from the Supervision Bureau would soon be introduced to the department, so they should be there as soon as possible. At the station, the chief thanked Chief Su-Yun for his speech. He went on to say that they fully support him in the future if their department needs help. Before he could finish, Su briefly said okay and started smiling sweetly. Then he said that he had heard that there was someone in their department named Joah Yu, and he had solved several cases in a row. At that time, the detective was on the phone asking to check who could have made a copy of the victim's house keys. The chief was attracted by his impudence and asked the people standing nearby if they knew who it was. The police officer took a sideways glance. A man in a suit and tie was approaching him with his hand outstretched, saying that he had recently been transferred here, and now they would be colleagues. Joah recognized him and shook his hand, smiling. The detective allowed himself to sit on a chair while the chief stood in front of him and asked if the police officer had time for dinner, because he wanted to treat him. To this invitation, Joah replied that of course he would be free, but he would pay as a gesture of welcome. The other officers were surprised by their conversation. As the policeman was climbing the stairs, he was drinking a small juice and heard someone shouting, "Stop hiding. If you don't come out now, they will break down his door." A blonde woman crying through the closed door said how dare he come here after beating her sister, and asked if he had any humanity. The man replied that this was the way to return the favor, because she should be grateful that their brother Hun liked her. Watching all this from the side, the detective assumed that this was the one who had beaten Hua Hua. Then he smilingly said that his fists immediately became so itchy, and without hesitation he called the guys who looked at each other, because they did not yet understand who they were addressing. Then they saw a man standing nearby, who raised his hand up as if in school and said his name was Tianlu, and then asked who was in charge. The guys asked again, "Tianlu, who is this guy?" And then they continued by putting one of them in front, saying that he was their big brother Hong from District C, and asked the detective where he came from, because it was the first time they had heard of him. Joah happily said, "So you're the big Hun," and he added that he had heard that District C has the most selective goods, and that even the little brother Hong could not afford them. One of the guys shouted that he was talking nonsense, because all the goods belonged to their boss anyway. The policeman added that's right. At the same time, he was holding his phone behind his back with the recorder on, and with his right hand pointing to class and raising his thumb up, Joah said that Pansy Hong was a big man in the neighborhood. After that, he started scratching his fists and stretching his arms. He said that if he beat him up, his name would also spread throughout the neighborhood. At this time, the girls were standing in the room under the door and trying to hear what was happening in the corridor, but they could not hear anything, so they assumed that they had left. But they opened the door a few centimeters, and what they saw surprised them. Joah was sitting on the face of the beaten boss and talking on his smartphone, saying that he would send the recording to the police station and the police would soon come here to arrest the dealers. He continued that they were selling drugs and abusing women. He asked if this was enough to put him in jail. The girls began to thank Joah with joy, because if not for him, the detective closed his eyes and said that his services were not free. And smiling, he added that the two immediately went to the room and washed themselves well, because they would have to work hard. This surprised the girls a bit, because they did not understand what exactly they would have to do. As they were climbing the stairs, one of the girls asked the other if she was also a detective, because a group of police officers had just come to their house and taken 3 bandits away. At the end, they asked if she had come with them. Meow said no, because she was looking for someone. When she approached one of the doors, the owner pointed to it and said that the person she was looking for lived here. But the door was open for some reason. When they went inside, they saw Joah lying on the bed in his underwear, while 2 beautiful ladies were giving him a massage, and he was just squealing with pleasure. Turning his head toward the front door, he saw the captain standing there and asked her where she was coming from. For a few minutes, the girl stood there silent, as she was in a slight shock from what she saw. And then she said that she was going to greet his boss and needed the detective to go with her to the police station and help with the trial of Jian Wenli. And at the end, she added that she thought he might be a little busy. At that time, Joah was already sitting on the bed, and the girls around him were smiling sweetly. However, he said that he was not at all. He asked them to wait for him for a while, because he needed to change his clothes. He went down the stairs. The detective was thinking that he didn't know why, but every time he met Meow, she seemed more and more beautiful. At this time, the captain was walking calmly, looking ahead and thinking about something. Joah looked at her carefully from head to toe and said quietly that he wished he could use his X-ray machine on her. And he began to imagine Meow washing herself completely naked in the shower. The girl interrupted his thoughtfulness by angrily asking where he was looking. As he got into the car, he replied that he was thinking about nothing. Then he asked if they caught the real killer, what would happen to Li Mai-feng. The lady sitting down on the seat replied that she already had an evil motive, so they would see what sentence they would pass. The detective said that her husband said he would hire the best lawyer to defend her. So, he thinks the result will be good. While having lunch with fried chicken, we could hear 2 men talking. One of them said that the killer's name was Mi Ai-jun. He limps on his right leg. He comes from the same village as Jian Wenli. The second said that his brother worked at a clothing factory owned by her family, and he always knew she was wealthy. The first added that he had called her husband, Liu Pingfei, when he came to him for help making a duplicate of the house keys, so he made another copy for himself. The interlocutor said that on that day he learned from his brother that Liu Pingfei and Jian Wenli would go to the factory, and then no one would be home, and it was the perfect moment to rob them. At this time, the detective laughingly told Meow to eat properly, because she needed vitamins to be healthy. The girl did not hesitate, and started throwing fish bones right into the detective's plate, who was a little embarrassed. One of the men came up to Yu and asked him how he had guessed that a person who made copies of keys was involved in this case. Joah happily replied that earlier during the interrogation, Lin Mai-feng had said that the door of Jian Wenli's house was locked, and then he asked the logical question of how the killer could have gotten in. While searching for evidence, detectives found no trace of a break-in. This suggests that the killer had the keys to the house. Question: where did he get them? Of course, first of all, suspicions fall on the person who makes duplicate keys. The man listening to all this said, "Wow, just brilliant." And another added that the detective had studied everything to the smallest detail. In her mind, Meow thought, braggart, but she said out loud that Officer Joah really is a sharp mind. Finally, she added that they really needed people like him. Looking sideways at the police officer, she went on to say that she had just been to his house and met his 2 girlfriends. One of them massaged his shoulders and the other his feet, and he was still not satisfied. This made Joah wonder if she was praising him or mocking him. However, he decided to interrupt her by saying that they were all about him. So about him. Captain Meow, for example, is a real martial artist, and added that last time she beat him so badly that he had no choice but to bite her ass. Meow jumped up and leaned on the table with her hands and shouted, "Joah, you!" And then she kicked him out of the cafe, telling him to leave and never show his face again. While searching for the right route, the detective said to himself, the first one started, and she didn't get the joke. Walking along the sidewalk, it turned out that it was very difficult to catch a taxi here. So, I thought that stupid Meow couldn't have chosen a cafe closer. Then I remembered the last episode in the cafe and wondered what she meant. Did he really hurt her so much that she didn't want to see him? In front of him, he saw two men sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall of the room, drinking beer and talking loudly. The detective was very pleased with what he saw and began to laugh with all his 32 white teeth, saying that he needed help. When Captain Meow was coming out of the alley, she saw a man in a hoodie with a hood and a hat on his head scratching the wheel of her car. She didn't think twice about it. She just jumped up and kicked him right in the head. Asking him what he was doing? Was he looking for death or something? Joah was watching from a few cars away and couldn't help but giggle at what he saw. One of the drunks asked him why this girl was so cruel. The detective remembered how he had met these two men, and at that moment he thought how good it was that he had come across them in time. So he approached them. He pointed at Zhao's car, then said that its owner was constantly insulting him, and asked them for a favor. He asked them if they could pour their fountain on the car. He wanted to teach this girl a lesson. The drunks asked him if he was confused. The policeman handed them a few bills and said he would pay $500 for it. The decision was up to them, and they agreed, because it was a very tidy sum for them, and one of them went to the car to fulfill the task. First he looked around and unzipped his pants, and then he began to urinate right on the wheel. This made the captain very angry. Meow continued to knead the man on the road, saying that he would not go anywhere until he washed her car to a shine. The man said he was mistaken and asked her not to kill him. Joah stood behind the van and laughed out loud. Suddenly, a man came out of the cafe and said that he thought he heard Gao's voice outside, so he decided to go out to see what was going on. Looking closely at the house in front of him, the detective didn't like something about it. After all, something was wrong here. He assumed that maybe these people were smuggling, and he saw a crowd of people with bats starting to move towards Meow, saying how dare she hit their friend. As he made his way through the crowd, the detective shouted for them to move aside and let him pass. When he got to the middle, he saw the girl beating one of the men. However, another man was standing behind her, raising a stool over her head to suddenly strike her. The captain turned back because something caught her attention. Namely, Joah had knocked out the one who wanted to hurt the girl while she was not looking. Meow wondered if he had helped her. However, she had to keep fighting off the man who started swinging his fists at her again. She grabbed him by the hair and slammed his face into her knee. This caused the man's nose to bleed. He tried to punch her in the face as well, but missed. Having fought back, Joah and Meow leaned against each other and started looking around, waiting for someone to attack again. But the policewoman suddenly turned around and elbowed the detective right in the nose. And then, smiling, she apologized and said she hadn't noticed him. The policeman, holding his nose in the middle of the road, said, "She hit me again." I opened my eyes and started looking forward and said, "Meow Ying." And moving after her, he said that she was dead. While walking along the road, I knocked out another man. At that time, she was dealing with the rest of the gang. Joah grabbed her shoulder, which scared her. He pulled her to him, pressed her close, and kissed her gently on the lips, holding her waist with one hand and her face with the other. The girl did not expect this, but at first she did not resist, but tried to enjoy it to the fullest. They stood there for a few seconds, and the lady, her eyes wide open, shouted. She pushed the man away, screaming at him to get off her. Joah could not understand why she did this. As they stood on the road opposite each other, their colleagues hurried over to them, saying, "What happened here? Who are all these people? Did Zhao Yu kiss Captain Meow?" The detective asked them to arrest these people because they were smuggling. After that, he put his hands in his pants pockets and started moving to the right, telling the police that he would show them where they were hiding all the stolen goods. Meow bit her lower lip. She briefly said that he was a psycho. When the detective returned home, he punched the wall in anger, saying that he was a fucking idiot. He did all this while standing in the shower. He was very upset. He imagined what would happen if she got hurt because of him. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, he said that he was no longer that street kid, so he needs to think about the consequences. When he came out of the bathroom, he saw that he had received an email from Yang Hong. At first, it was an apology for bothering him, but the man's attention was drawn to the blonde and her sister, who were lying on his bed in their underwear. However, he continued to read the text message, which said that they thought that the henchman of Hoon's boss would want to take revenge on him. Therefore, they advised him to live somewhere else. The letter ended with the words, "All the best." Joah began to wonder why the two of them had moved in with him, while they were sleeping so peacefully. Looking at the girls, the detective said, but he also wanted to sleep on the bed, so he lay down right between them, putting his leg over the blonde. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the man found himself curled up on the floor. The ladies laughed at him because they pushed him out of bed. In the morning, in the Joah smoked a cigarette, put his bag on the table, and said to someone that he had heard that he was a great specialist. He said that he had some old bills in his bag. He then asked if he could tell him their value. The man replied that he could, but he needed their serial number. Opening the bag, my colleague opened his mouth in surprise and said, "Oh my God, there are so many of them, at least 200,000. Then he added that this is a very rare series. Each of them is worth 5 times its face value. The detective was smiling, because he was very pleased with the information he had heard. He began to think that the system probably wanted him to get rich. Then the guy examined the bag carefully and asked where the detective had found it. The man answered the question with why. The young man said that the database said that it contained money to redeem one of the cases, and then he began to tell me that it was related to a case of child theft. Their parents gave all this money to the thieves. After that, he asked the policeman if he had any relation to the criminal. Joah, smiling slyly, asked him to guess. The assistant added that 26 years ago, several wealthy families lived in the village of Am. Because the conditions for their children's education were not the best, they decided to send them to a private school in the city. The families hired a driver named New Wei Guang. He was to accompany them to school on a special occasion. The car was red in color. One day on their way to school, they drove into a tunnel. They moved there for a few meters at low speed and suddenly just disappeared without a trace. It was about 12 o'clock in the morning. A lot of police came to the mine where Joah found the bag with the money. Everyone had to look around to see if they could find any evidence. The assistant, standing in a special raincoat, continued that 3 days after the car disappeared, the thieves contacted the parents and demanded a ransom of $1 million. But after the family handed over all the money, the criminals stopped contacting them. And in all these 26 years, the police have not found any clues. The detective listened attentively to all the information while smoking a cigarette. Then the girl showed a photo of that ominous bag. She said that it had a butterfly sticker on it, exactly like the one he found. Colleague who was sitting in the car with the window open added that Joah managed to catch the criminal and find a clue to investigate another case, and sometimes he thinks he has some kind of superpowers. The detective was wondering if it was the system again. It seemed strange to him at first. How could such a large sum of money appear in such an abandoned place? The other policemen were talking among themselves, trying to figure out what they should find in such a remote place. One of them said that nothing at all and that they had come here in vain. Suddenly, someone shouted loudly that they had found something, and this attracted everyone's attention. The journalists turned on their cameras and started asking if it was true that the police had found the bodies of the children who had been kidnapped 26 years ago, and if all the victims had been found. Please, what can he say about this case? Because they were told that the mayor of the city had also arrived. The families of the abductees have collected several million in compensation. Is this true? The head of the department replied that as soon as he had any news, he would inform them. But for now, he had no comment. So he asked everyone to leave. Joah reasoned that no one expected that all these 26 years in this mine. There were corpses of stolen children. Opening the door to his office, he said that the investigation into the kidnapping of children in District M was starting right now. He found himself in a conference room where an assistant started waving at him as she took a seat next to him. Behind the podium, the chief spoke, saying that 5 bodies had been found in an abandoned mine. Using DNA tests, the police were able to identify 4 children. Their names are Liang Mei Li, 9 years old, Liang Zhuhang, 12 years old, Tao Zhao, 11 years old, Liu Hongxiang, 10 years old. Another corpse belongs to a driver named New Wei Guang. When it was 12 o'clock in the morning, the detective was quietly walking around the police station. Suddenly he stopped in front of the window and looked at the full moon in the sky. and emphasized that Peng was a son. These were the parents of the kidnapped Tao Zhao, 11 years old. A few hours ago, Zhao's co-worker introduced him to his parents, telling them that he was the one who found the crime scene and the bag of money. His father shook his hand and thanked him for everything he had done. He added that, to be honest, they were tired of the unknown. He gave them a chance to say goodbye to their son, so he was very grateful for that. After that, he started to cry very hard. However, he continued to hold the detective's hand. Joah, in turn, promised that he would find the killer at any cost. Then the policeman looked out the window and thought that the only person who had not been found yet was Cece. If she was still alive, she would be 33 years old by now. He asked himself if it would be possible to find her by the image drawn by the specialists. Continuing to move around the police station, he noticed a light on in one of the offices. The man noticed that it was quite late, but someone hadn't gone home yet. So he looked through the small crack between the doors and saw Gu Ping, who always takes investigations seriously, never losing hope. Suddenly, she noticed that someone was secretly watching her. Turning her head towards the door, she saw Joah and asked why he was still here. The man leaned against the wall, folded his arms across his chest, and said, laughing, that he had come to learn from her. Gu replied that she might not like him, but she appreciated his talents. Then, smiling, she offered to tell him what he thought about the case. Joah stood at the entrance for a few minutes, thinking it over. Then he approached the girl, threw his arm around her shoulders as if to hug her, and smilingly said that he would take it as a compliment. Taking the marker in his hands, he offered to get down to business. He said that for so long, the police could not find a single clue to the theft because they thought the kidnappers had prepared a perfect plan in advance. The lady stood quietly and listened attentively to everything the detective said, and crossing out the words "perfect plan" with 2 lines. The man continued, "What if their kidnapping was just an accident?" Lu was surprised and asked, "But how?" Joah said that usually after kidnappings, the perpetrators immediately contact the victim's family and demand a ransom. The goal of this is to prevent the parents from going to the police. But they called only 3 days after the disappearance. Isn't it very strange to do this? Kidnappers usually take their victims away in their cars. But in this case, the car disappeared along with the children. Minibuses are more likely to catch people's eyes. Besides, if they had run out of fuel on the way, they would have had big problems. Judging by the information they received, there were at least 3 hijackers. There were 5 children and 1 adult in the car. If you add 3 more people, it's unlikely they would all fit. Lu put her hand on her chin and thought that this was a very interesting assumption, and the detective sounded so confident and convincing. And then she said out loud, "If they weren't professionals, how did they even think to make the call, demand a ransom, kill the hostages, and escape?" Before that, everything was done perfectly. Joah smilingly said that she had never been kidnapped, so it is clear that she does not know what it is like. Kidnapping is a highly skillful job. He went on to say that he knows many criminals, and none of them could commit such a perfect crime. Therefore, he assumes that they did not have any plan at first. They just wanted to take the car or steal money. However, they never expected so many people to be in the car. The girl stopped his story and asked him what he meant by never stealing, and then she added as if he had stolen. Yawning, the detective asked what she was thinking. When investigating such cases, they must look at everything through the eyes of the perpetrators. The girl emphasized in her mind that he certainly did not look like someone who would do such a thing. And she said out loud that according to him, the driver of the car, Nu Wei Guang, was innocent and not on the same team as the kidnappers. Joah replied that he and his children were from the same village and enjoyed their work. Therefore, it made no sense for him to participate in the kidnapping. But if those kidnappers are still alive, they are all rich. Lu asked why. The policeman said, "Just think, there's a bag with $200,000 in cash in that mine, and only they know about it. If they were poor, would they leave it there?" The lady added that it turns out they still have a clue, and they can check everyone who suddenly received a large sum of money in those years. The detective said that if they didn't narrow down the suspects, it would be very difficult. So Lou said that if they start now, they will definitely find them. And in the end, she said that she hoped they were still alive. At this time, a transparent screen appeared on which it was written that the happy meeting was successful. The degree of completion was 97%, and the invisible detector X10 was obtained. And at the end, an explanation that the device works with an accuracy of 20 meters, can check for listening devices, cameras, and other tracking devices. It can also indicate their location and time of use for 10 minutes. Then the detective noticed a doctor sitting at her desk and asked her if she was waiting for him and offered to have a drink. The lady replied briefly and clearly that she was waiting for him to solve the crime. After that, she handed him the sheets and told him that they were the results of the autopsy. The man immediately started reading them. The mine collapsed due to an explosion, and all 5 victims had shockwave marks on their bodies. But it is not known whether they died as a result of the explosion or whether it occurred after they had all died. Ropes were found near the bodies. It can be assumed that they were all tied up and were still wearing them even during the explosion. Traces of blows were found on the left side of the body of the driver, Nu Wei Guang. At least one of his ribs was broken, and he also had knife wounds. It is assumed that he was beaten while he was still alive, and the blow came near his heart, which could have caused his death. While the detective was reading the report, his colleagues were discussing his achievements and actions in this case without hesitation. Suddenly, someone shouted that the captain was coming. When he entered the room, one of the police officers said that he had finally returned. Then she asked him why he hadn't warned her earlier. The man replied that he had already been discharged with difficulty, and she wanted him back. Another cop said that he had also just found out, and said that they had managed to solve many cases while the captain was away. Finally, he suggested that they have lunch together, as he had already made a reservation. Joah was angry with this conversation and said in his mind, "I'm sick of people thinking about money and food all day long. Compared to Ku Ping, who always makes the most of herself, these people are just a bunch of garbage." And he said angrily, "If they want to eat, then let them get out of here. I'm sick and tired of their chatter." And in the end, he asked if they could stop interfering with people's work. This speech surprised everyone and even made them silent for a few minutes. At that time, the head of the city council, Director Liao, thought that the detective wanted his teammates to hate him. Then he put his hands in the pockets of his classic trousers and slowly walked over to Joah, who was standing with his back to him. Gently putting his hand on his shoulder, he said, "Hello, nephew." Everyone present was shocked, to put it mildly. Their eyes grew huge and their mouths opened to the maximum, and they started whispering, repeating, "Nephew, nephew." Then the chief added that the detective should follow him, because they needed to talk. Joah, leaning against the rack, also could not understand what was going on, and who this man was. When they came out into the hallway, the policeman folded his arms across his chest and wondered what this guy was up to. But he asked what exactly the director wanted from him. The colleagues tried to overhear what they were talking about through the door without being noticed. Opening a bottle of energy drink, the man replied that he had done everything in his power. Then he began to drink the drink in small sips. Turning around to leave, the chief again put his hand on the detective's left shoulder and added that he should try to show his temper less. When the director left, his colleagues ran up to Joah and started asking what they were talking about, because they are all friends in the department. The officer replied that they hadn't talked about anything interesting. After a not-so-good morning, the detective went to the cliff. Looking down, he said that this was the very place where the kidnappers demanded a ransom. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by an assistant who kept shouting, "Senior! Senior!" The man was annoyed and turned to her and shouted at her why she was yelling, because it almost made him fall off a cliff. After receiving ice cream from the assistant, he took a bite and calmed down, and began to tell us that when the children's parents came to the cliff, they saw the radio the kidnappers had prepared for them. This means that at least one of them was next to them and was watching their actions. They were forced to stand near the red line they had drawn and throw the bag with the money in the same place. Therefore, one more of the criminals had to be there, and another one had to watch the children. The assistant went on to say that according to Captain Ku Ping's report, they were able to take the money under close police surveillance and hide their tracks, and they were aware of the bug inside the bag. They were fully aware of the police's actions. Therefore, the cops assumed that either they used to work at the police station or they had their own person here. Joah said that the composition of the substance that exploded was similar to what is usually used for bombing. Taking out his phone, the man suggested that perhaps there was also someone among the perpetrators who had been involved in this kind of work. Picking up the phone, he said, "Hello," and stood there for a few minutes listening to the message. Suddenly he shouted, "What?" and then added that he needed to play the bully. He pushed the blond man's face to the ground. Joah said they were a bunch of worthless assholes. He asked if they even knew who they were crossing. Squatting down, the detective lifted the man's head by his hair and ordered him to open his eyes and look at him. Then he introduced himself, saying that his name was Tianlu's brother, and this was Liang's senior boss, pointing his finger at the boss. The culprit said they didn't know about the rules. He promised that it would not happen again. This did not stop the detective, and he asked who ordered them to start a pogrom in the restaurant. The chief suggested that the one with the glasses and his name was Xiao Mazhao. Joah said to call this guy and tell him to come here himself. The victim said they barely knew him, and they didn't have his phone number. He just gave them 20 grand each to kick out all the visitors. The officer put his hands in his pants pockets and said what kind of idiots they were. After all, he had heard that Fei Long hires people for 200,000, and the men agreed to help for 20 grand for quality. He added that they didn't even know who they were working for. Then he ordered them to leave the money and get out of here. The gentleman, who was still lying on the ground, said that he didn't have any cash, so he asked if he could send it later. The detective said seriously, and the man was afraid of this tone, so he said that he was joking and asked someone to help him pay extra. At that time, the chief started laughing very loudly. After that, he turned to Joah and said that he was a genius, because he managed to play it so that even he believed it. The policeman said that it was immediately obvious that they were new to the criminal world and had no experience. Liang went on to invite the detective to become a special investigator in their inspection discipline department. In the future, if he encounters a similar situation, he will be able to arrange a showdown and drag in as many people involved in the criminal case as possible. Joah put his hand on his face and said that he did not expect them to use such methods. The chief continued that he was an officer and should understand that they pay for their blood. To catch a big fish, you need to set a big net, and to catch them all, they need to know everything about the internal system. The detective, raising his glass, noticed that the man had come to the city of Q to conduct his investigation. The head of the supervision was just a cover, to which the gentleman replied that he had revealed his true identity to him today. After all, he had just forced them to reveal the name of one of their top, Xiao Mazhao, and added that he did not expect him to be such a good gangster, just a professional in his field. Smiling, Joah said that he wanted to say that he was like them. Liang replied that the word similar was not appropriate. While they were clinking glasses, the policeman mentioned a man. Then he quickly got up and headed for the exit, saying that he had an urgent matter and would see him later. The chief was very pleased with what had happened. However, he said that Joah does not sit in one place. When we arrived at the QN prison, a place where particularly dangerous criminals are kept in custody, a man wearing a sleeping mask and handcuffs was taken out of the cell. He was brought to an interrogation room where a detective was sitting on a chair. The detective reasoned that he was the most experienced professional in kidnapping cases. It turned out to be Jiao Hai, who was guilty of the murders of the kidnapped victim plus 2 accomplices shot dead. He was involved in many kidnappings. We can say that the detective is facing a master of his craft. Because the kidnapped victim died of a heart attack, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Joah said seriously that he would get straight to the point, but he asked in what situation he could kill a hostage. This question surprised the prisoner, and he asked if he hadn't read his case. He added that the woman he had kidnapped had had a heart attack, so he did not kill her. The purpose of the kidnapping was to demand a ransom, so no one would want to kill a hostage. The detective continued that he was investigating the case of M, but he came to get the information he needed from him, so he was not interested in his case. Besides, if he proves useful to him, the policeman might help him get out of here. The prisoner began to tell him what he had heard about the case. There are many reasons for killing hostages. For example, the victim could see the kidnapper's face, and he is very afraid to reveal himself. Or the family did not cooperate with them and went to the police. And another option is that the hostages could have had health problems, perhaps even that they tried to escape and it ended badly. And in the end, he added that it seemed to him that M's case was not one of them. The policeman sat and thought about all the above words, and the man sitting opposite him in handcuffs shouted that real psychopaths were involved in this case, because they dared to kidnap poor children, took all the money and just killed them. No humanity whatsoever. Besides, it made no sense for them to kidnap the driver. Why would they do that? They could have kidnapped only the children and sent the driver to their families and demanded a ransom through him, or they could have given him a knife with blood on it and scared the parents into handing over their money faster. At the same time, Joah was thinking that he would be an idiot to take such a strong guy hostage. It would be mega risky, and he assumed that the driver was also somehow involved in this case. But he remembered that there was another guy in the room who might be able to help. A few hours later, the next man was brought into the interrogation room and immediately asked for a cigarette. It turned out to be Yang Wentao, the killer who drowned the victim in the Q reservoir and was caught by a detective in a mine where a bag of ransom and the dead bodies were found. After taking one puff, the man asked how he could help, since he had nothing to do with the kidnapping. Joah stood in front of him and asked how he found the mine where he was hiding. And the prisoner began to tell him that in the early years, mining in the mines of their town was contracted to private individuals. If you had money, you could invest in exploring several mines and try your luck. If there was silver or other precious metals, you would become much richer. But if it was empty, the result could be disastrous for you. On the drawings, those mines were marked as empty. They said there was nothing there, and he added that he didn't know anything about that mine before. He just went there because a detective started following him. Joah asked who built the fence. The man replied that he did not know, because he had been there all the time. The next question from the policeman was whether the prisoner knew with whom the contract for the mine was signed, because they had to get the contractor's permission to implement the project. But he was already dead when they found him, and his family was ruined and left with nothing. He added that his name seemed to be Chen Sanli. The officer stood there with a cigarette between his teeth and paused for a few seconds, lost in thought. After that, he came to the R station, where Ku Ping clarified by saying Chen Sanli. The detective said he thought he might have been one of the kidnappers. When he took the money, he signed a contract for the mine, but he had a conflict with his partner, and as a result, he was killed, and his family is now on the street. The girl said it was a pretty good theory, and she would send people to get information about this guy right away. And smiling, she added that he had surprised her again because he went to ask the criminals themselves for advice. Joah spoke happily as if she had known him for the first day. Lou put her hand over his mouth, which surprised him, and said briefly, "Enough." Because as soon as she praises him, he starts to wonder. The policeman said that when they solve the case, she will have to give back half of her bonus, to which the lady replied that she would not give a single coin. She put her hands behind her back and smiled sweetly, and said that she would be able to go to dinner with him. After hearing this, the man put his hands behind his head and looked at the board and said that it was a great idea, but he would pay for it himself. At this time, the information that the happy meeting was over was displayed on the transparent screen. The completion rate was 76%, and the invisible night vision device had been received. At 7 in the morning, Joah was woken up by the phone. It turned out that he hadn't gone home, but had stayed at the station and fallen asleep sitting at his desk. Without raising his head, he put the phone to his ear. He woke up quickly and was surprised to hear the information. He shouted out what the hell he was saying, and then threw the phone so hard that it broke into 2 pieces. He quickly rushed to the scene of the tragedy, where there were already many police officers. He shouted at them why they were standing there, why they couldn't help her, why they had to take her to the hospital. The doctors he was addressing stood silently with their heads down. One of his colleagues, crying, asked the detective to calm down, and the sad assistant finally decided to address Joah. However, she didn't have time to say anything, because Joah started shouting angrily again why they were just standing there, because Ku Ping couldn't have died. And then tears quickly began to flow from his eyes. The girl's body was lying bloody on the ground. One of the doctors crouched down to examine her. The detective asked if Ku was still alive. Then he turned to his colleagues and shouted that they should not stand still, but help the policewoman. A doctor he knew came up to him and slapped him hard. She told him to calm down. The man turned to her crying and said, "Ku Ping is dead." Sister Xing turned to the chief saying that they should take the body to the police station for tests to find out the cause of death. The chief asked Xiaozhang and other officers to lift her. However, Joah picked up the girl's body. He carried her and carefully put her in the car. Then the police department considered the case of Ku Ping's death. Yesterday at night, when she was driving home on the road, an unforeseen circumstance happened. There were clear braking marks near the car, but no collision occurred. Therefore, we can assume that a pedestrian crossing the road could have been in front of her. She immediately applied the brakes and got out of the car to check if anything had happened. At that moment, someone stabbed her with a knife and stole her bag. Unfortunately, her colleague's car was not equipped with a camera, and the street was under construction, so the police had no pictures to verify their theory. Therefore, it can be assumed that Ku Ping's death was an accident. The criminal just wanted to steal money, but a fight broke out between them, as a result of which the girl was stabbed. Listening to all this, Joah realized that things were clearly not that simple. If the criminal had only planned to kidnap her, he would have run away when he saw her wearing a police uniform. There were many stab wounds on her body. Does this look like an unforeseen circumstance? But if she was not killed by accident, who would have wanted her dead? But I remembered how she was supposed to send people to check out the information about one of the suspects, and Joah wondered if it had anything to do with him. The doctor came into the office and said that she had found something strange. The autopsy results came back, and although there were many stab wounds on Ku's body, the stabbing that killed him was the one that hit him in the back, as it went straight to the heart and broke all the bones in that area. Joah emphasized that the killer was clearly a professional in this case. Suddenly, one of the policemen shouted that there was news. About 1 kilometer away from the crime scene, a knife was found in a garbage can, covered in blood and with Ho Meng's fingerprints on it. Another said that he knew him because he often came to them and had already served time in prison for theft and possession of firearms. As it turned out, the cameras showed that he was holding a police bag. They all started to leave the office saying they were going to take revenge. At the same time, Joah watched the CCTV footage and reasoned that the weapon was found within a kilometer radius and that although Ho Meng was not far from Ku Ping's corpse, he did not have a knife in his hand. In addition, according to the recording, he was either drunk or had taken a dose. No matter what anyone says, Ku Ping is an experienced officer. How could he have killed her in that state? If so, then there was another killer. At 12 o'clock in the morning, the police station was still crowded. They were all discussing whether they had found the person they had seen on the video, and at the same time the detective stood looking at the photo of the victim on the honor board. His colleagues continued to say that their people were watching his girlfriend's bar and his friend's house at the moment. If he did not show up in 24 hours, it would be very difficult to find him. Suddenly someone asked that last night they were looking for information about a man named Chen Sanli. The programmer replied that they had, but they hadn't found anything, so they all decided to go home. Then he noticed that she was feeling a little sick and offered to help. The girl smilingly replied that it was not necessary. Let him also go home quickly and get some rest, and they will meet tomorrow. And then the man burst into tears, saying if only he had insisted on his own way and gave her a ride, this would not have happened. At that time, Joah promised her in his mind that she had not died in vain, and he would not only catch the perpetrator of the crime, but also catch the one who dared to attack her. The next thing he did was to tell his colleagues that he had a way to force this Ho Meng to show himself. and at the end he turned around and asked who would go with him. When the detective and his partner arrived at the meeting place, a man was already waiting for them there. While Joah was walking to the room, he tried to quickly finish his cigarette, and his men said they had caught the girl. Bo Hao had called her in the morning and said that he had gotten into a fight and needed to lay low for a while, so he went to ask some guy named Lee Chunhua for help. The detective calmly asked if the young lady had received her punishment. The gang leader replied that she had, though she had fought for a long time, and they had to break a few bones to open her mouth. Joah's partner had already grabbed the guard who was supposed to look after Ho Meng's girl. He asked them to relax because he would get them out soon, and he started moving along the road with two giant men walking on either side of him. While they were driving in the car, his partner said that Hu's girlfriend had deceived them, because she was clearly in contact with him after the incident. Another policeman added that he had heard that this guy had big connections in the government, and he also has a lot of cronies at the tea club. The redhead replied that they had already interrogated him, and he was standing by because he had not contacted the suspect. The man then asked Joah what would happen if he still did not confess. The detective calmly asked if anyone in the car had a gun with them. When they got to the right place, they entered the room and started shouting at everyone to stay in their seats because the police were working. They ordered us to do whatever they said. The gang leader said that he had been living in the neighborhood for so many years and had never had anything against their respected police. Even their boss is afraid to cross him, and in the end he asked what this bunch of young officers could do to him. And then he turned to Joah and asked if he had the guts to do it. After these words, the detective punched the man in the face. He knocked him to the floor. The main bandit got up a little. He held his cheek and asked how he dared to hit him in the first place. Joah put his foot on his shoulder and briefly said, "Talk." A few seconds later, he added, "Where is Ho Meng now?" The man said he had already told him several times that he did not know. After that, he said that they didn't even know what they had done, because now they couldn't leave. The detective looked sideways at his red-headed partner and gave him a sign, and the latter in turn realized what he had to do next. He raised his gun and fired. The audience turned around because they were frightened and very upset by what had happened. Joah said that they were investigating the murder of Officer Ku Ping. Leaning slightly toward the leader, he added that if anyone made a move, they would be shot as an accomplice to the murder. Lee Chunhua is a smart man. If there was no order from above, these young officers would not have dared to disturb him like this. But since he does not want to tell the truth, he will remain crippled for life. The detective then raised his leg to strike the bandit's leg hard. The gangster was frightened and begged the policeman to listen to him. He told him to believe that he did not know where Ho Meng had gone, but he could help find him. Joah kept stepping on the man's foot. The man began to writhe in pain, rolling on the floor. Tears appeared in his eyes, and he added that it was unnecessary. He started beating him again and shouted that the man they were looking for was in warehouse number 1. When they arrived at the warehouse, it was already night. Rudy called his colleagues at the police station and asked for reinforcements. He then told Joah that the warehouse they needed was very large, and they did not know exactly where Ho Meng was, and there were only 3 of them, and asked if they should split up or wait for backup. The detective replied that they had no time to wait. Maybe their people are following Lee Chunhua, but they know exactly how he communicates with Ho Meng. If he finds out that they are here, he will run away from them again. The redhead said that he would see if there was anything strange on the map, because they couldn't let the bastard escape. And suddenly they saw a man behind them and said, "Ho Meng." The man froze for a few minutes, and then he started running away. The policeman started to catch up with him and shouted at him to stop, because he was being chased by the police. The attacker ran into one of the open doors. The detectives ran into the room after him. What they saw surprised them. Suddenly the lights came on, blinding Joah. After getting used to the bright light, the detective realized that this was their lair. That made him even angrier. Hao pointed his finger in front of him and shouted for people to stop the pursuers, because it was the police. Everyone jumped out of their beds, pulled out their bats, and started running in a crowd toward the 3 detectives. Joah started fighting with those who were attacking him. Then he shouted for his colleagues to go and catch Ho Meng. The redhead ran to catch the man, Another policeman said they were all crazy. One of the criminals hid Joah behind his back. However, the detective approached the bed and hit him against it. The next one hit the officer on the head with a baton, which broke it into small pieces. Joah began to bleed from the place of the blow. He turned to the attacker. He continued to hold one of the pieces of the stick in his hands. The detective was called by a colleague who was being attacked by several men. Joah grabbed the stick and struck the person who had hurt him. The colleagues who saw it all screamed, "What the hell?" The detective knocked the attacker to the ground and bent his head over him. It turned out that he had struck him right near the collarbone. And for a few seconds he sat silently watching the man. However, at that moment another bandit decided to attack the detective with a knife because he had killed their friend. Joah stabbed him with a sharp stick as well. The man began to slowly fall to the ground, dropping his weapon. Then he began to scream loudly in pain, and because he saw a stick sticking out of his stomach, the detective picked up his sword and stood in front of the attacker. The rest of the crowd gathered around them and watched what would happen next. After that, they began to put their weapons on the ground one by one, because they were already frightened by the policeman's actions. Joah moved slowly in a circle and watched them. Then he started walking toward the exit door. While they were running through the warehouse, the redhead was showing Hu Meng the corners. He noticed that there were no cars nearby, so he couldn't run far. Suddenly, Joah saw a motorcycle in front of him and remembered that it was good that he had a universal key that he had received for the task. So he quickly got on the vehicle. Suddenly, however, he heard the sound of a gunshot, and he saw his partner. He approached him and asked what happened to him and where Hu Meng was. The man replied that the criminal was a few meters away and had a gun, so they had to be careful. Joah stepped on the gas and asked the redhead to trust him. He began to chase the fugitive, who had no strength left and could no longer run. However, behind him, he noticed a detective who was riding a motorcycle. So he stopped, turned around, pulled out his gun and fired, saying, "Die, fucking cop." After the shot, he saw that there was no one on the bike. He just moved towards it on his own, but as he approached, he knocked the man down so that he fell on his back, and for several seconds he was rolling on the ground in pain. But in an instant, he saw a silhouette in front of him holding a metal barrel. For some reason, Hao thought it was a ghost and was very scared. However, he did not have time to scream because Joah had already hit him in the face. And then he pulled a gun on him, and the time for using the invisible suit ran out, and a shot rang out. The transparent screen shows that the degree of completion is 96%. The resulting invisible breathing apparatus, this device can provide oxygen. The time of action is 10 minutes. Next, events take place in Department R, where the detective asked Ms. Wang to work a little easier, and grabbing her ass, he added that he was a living person, not a corpse. The girl was surprised by this act and replied that if she was soft, she would not be able to sew his wound. However, he still needed to make an appointment to visit the hospital and have a full examination so that he would not have any further health problems. The detective held his head and said it was nothing. Then he asked the captain's wife why she was looking at him like that. The lady replied that she had to keep an eye on him because he would do something again. Several guys came into the room. They raised their hands to the head and greeted me. One said that they were members of Group B, and on behalf of their captain, Ku Ping, they were grateful for his help in finding the killer. Another added that, to be honest, he didn't like Joah, but now everything had changed. They added that if he needed their help, he could contact them any time. The detective smilingly turned to the boys and asked them to stop, because she was his friend too. Then the boys said that the chief wanted to see Zhao. When the detective entered the office, he asked why the boss wanted to remove him from his job. The chief said that he had abused his authority, hired people to beat up the suspect's girlfriend, prevented officers from investigating, and finally broke a man's leg. 12 people were hospitalized with serious wounds, 5 are still in the hospital, and 1 is in critical condition under close medical supervision. And in the end, he added that he had managed to create a lot of problems. Do officers have the right to behave like that? Joah shouted that there were 40 people there, but only 3 of them. Last night in the evening, they just attacked them all. They had to defend themselves. Did I need to pat each of them on the head while they were fighting back? The chief slammed his fist on the table and shouted at them to stop, because they were police officers. and therefore responsible for all their actions. The detective also banged on the desk and said that before Lu Ping's death, they were investigating the case of M. Therefore, there is a possibility that the two cases are related. In the video from the coup crime scene, you can see Hu Meng leaving, but there is no record of how he got there. He was not holding a weapon, but he was found a kilometer away from the scene of the attack in a trash can. In the other direction, it turns out that he had an accomplice, or someone just set him up. This person knew about Ku Ping's every move, which means that he was clearly not just passing by. Maybe they had a mole in their department. He added that he had to solve the case immediately. The chief stood up and said that when you solve a crime, you have to have solid evidence. The complaint against him was on its way, and he was aware of it. But a minute later, he continued that if he hadn't caught Hu Meng, he would have been put in a cell long ago. Because of him, he had to listen to his superior's reproaches. So he should be thankful that he hadn't kicked the yogi out yet. After listening to everything, Joah said, "Fuck you," and gave him his middle finger, adding that if he didn't want the detective to work, he should clean up the mess himself. A mark on the transparent screen showed that the degree of completion was 85%, and the universal unlocker was received. Suddenly, Ku Ping appeared in front of Joah, sitting and eating quietly. The man asked what she was doing here. The girl asked where else would she be, and then added, "Who knows, maybe he just wanted to have lunch with her after he solved the case." The detective bowed his head and apologized. After all, if he hadn't asked her to look for information about Cha Sanli, maybe nothing would have happened to her. Lu raised her glass and said that it was enough to be a hero. How does he know that this is related to M's case? The man said he would definitely find the person who did this to her. No matter how hard it is, he will get them all out of the ground. The girl said calmly and confidently that she had no doubt about it. When the man was sleeping, he was crying like a river. They rolled right onto his pillow. The next day was Lu Ping's funeral ceremony. All his family and colleagues gathered there. Joah saw the girl's son asking his father why his mother did not wake up, and then he asked to wake her up because he wanted to play with her, and the detective began to think that no matter what, he had to go back to the police station and continue investigating the case of M. Because he needed to find out who killed Lu, because he would never forgive himself. Suddenly, he heard someone calling him. He took out his smartphone and saw that it was an unknown number. However, he picked up the phone and heard that there was a car to his left that he had to go to alone and quickly. Joah wondered why this annoying guy wanted him again. Approaching the car where Director Liao was sitting with the door open, he asked what his orders were, and then he added that he was meeting with a spy. The man did not answer, but instead opened the back door where the detective saw Mr. Jin, the director of Department R, who was recovering from an illness. At that moment, the director shouted, "What is he doing? He should be lifting him up right away." Once in the wheelchair, the man said he wanted to ask Joah how Cho Ping died. The detective replied that the man's name was Hu Meng. Suddenly, one of the slippers fell off the director's foot and fell to the ground. Joah went and bent down and picked it up. Then he walked over to the wheelchair and put the shoes on the headmaster's foot, kneeling down in front of him. Then he continued to roll the wheelchair along the sidewalk. The flip-flop came off again, but on the other foot, and this made the detective wonder what the hell was going on, because he couldn't move his limbs, and he had just asked Joah to pick him up. Is he joking with him? Then the director told the detective to quickly put on his shoes. This made the man quite angry, but he went to put them on. While he was doing this, he was thinking that he should have forced the insolent man to stand up himself. But at that moment, he was hit on the head with a bouquet from the director. Joah could not stand it and shouted that he had stitches on his head. He wanted them to go away. The chief did not answer, just told him to roll him quickly, because he wanted to get to the car. Holding his head, the detective thought about how much it hurt. This old man was definitely a psycho. After a few maidens, the detective was handed a book and told that Mr. Jin had said that if he died, this book should be cremated with him. Since Joah was the one who helped him, it was now his. The officer asked what was wrong with the main one. The policeman replied that he had osteosarcoma. Amputation of both legs would give him an extra 4 months of life, but he did not want to bother. The man then asked Joah if he knew about the massacre at Mount H. He said he had heard about it. The book contains 5 large-scale national cases of the first level. All of them are unsolved. Mr. Jin personally investigated them. However, he could not find anything else, so he decided that you would be his successor, because he saw you as his personal shadow. Turning to face the detective, the policeman asked if he felt a weight on his shoulders. Joah smilingly said that the man was a brazen fox, wanting to lead him by the nose and make him work for him. The man said that if the detective did not need the book, he could give it to him. The detective hides the book in his cardigan pocket and says that he is Joah Yu, a man who hates evil and supports justice. How can he let the murderers escape justice? Then he added that the last time the man came to his office to help him, he thought something was wrong with him, but it turned out that Mr. Jin trusted him. But now he is alienated by that jerk Joe and he can't do anything. So he asked the man to help him get his job back. The black-haired man asked where were the documents about his suspension. There are not even any papers about it. Mr. Zhou just wants to teach the detective a lesson. And in the end, he asked if Joah knew how much he had done for him. If not for him, the officer would have been handcuffed long ago. After all, this Ji Chunhua still can't leave him alone and is using his last connections to grab the detective. The furious officer said that he would take care of this reckless guy today, and he began to move toward the exit of the forest. The man shouted in his wake that he was now in the crosshairs, so he shouldn't cause trouble. Joah replied that he shouldn't worry, because he was not that stupid. He added that he would definitely take back his statement, and as soon as he dealt with him, he would take care of business. The detective was already at the tea house, holding a tube of tea in his hand, and asking G if it was expensive. After all, he wanted to buy it in honor of the CEO. And then he asked him, smiling, if he thought it was good. This made Z very angry, and he stood up from the table.